Chapter 1. Introduction, Concept and Meaning of Esotericism. When you hear the word esotericism today, certain associations immediately arise in many people. One thinks of incense sticks, tarot cards, gemstones, horoscopes, or spiritual seminars in which people try to find their inner balance. Others, on the other hand, see esotericism as a reservoir of pseudoscientific claims that are in a critical light. Still others associate it with mysterious teachings that are supposed to be accessible only to a select few. These first impressions already show how complex and difficult the term is. The history of esotericism is not that of a clearly defined movement, but rather a widely ramified web of ideas, practices, and traditions that have developed over thousands of years and that are still present today in changing forms. The term esotericism originally comes from ancient Greek. The word esoterikos means inward or inward. Even in ancient times, it was used to designate teachings that were not generally accessible, but were reserved only for a small circle of students. In contrast to this is the term exoteric, which stands for the outward-looking, generally available knowledge. This distinction makes it clear that esotericism was not only about content from the beginning, but also about the type of access. Esoteric knowledge was not intended to be open to everyone, but was intended as secret, hidden, or only intended for the initiated. In the course of history, the scope of esotericism has changed considerably. In ancient times, it was closely associated with religious and philosophical schools, which passed on their wisdom in riddles, symbols, and rituals. In late antiquity and the Middle Ages, they were associated with alchemy, astrology, or Kabbalah, areas that moved on the border between science, religion, and magic. In modern times, the term has been associated with secret brotherhoods such as the Rosicrucians or the Freemasons. Finally, in the 19th and 20th centuries, esotericism appeared in new forms, in spiritualism, in theosophy, in anthroposophy, and in the New Age. Each epoch produced its own forms, but they are all united by the idea that there is a special, hidden knowledge that points beyond the visible world. Characteristic of esoteric thinking is the idea that there is a deeper truth behind visible reality. This truth is not immediately recognizable, but requires a special kind of knowledge. While science explains the world through observation, experiments, and logical conclusions, esotericism relies on intuition, symbols, revelations, and inner experiences. Nature is not only considered a mechanical system, but a living, permeated whole that is connected to humans. As above, so below is a well-known esoteric principle that expresses that microcosm and macrocosm correspond with each other. Man reflects the order of the universe, and the secret of the whole can be seen inside man. Another central feature of esotericism is its diversity. It is not a closed system with fixed dogmas, but rather a collective term for currents that often combine very different contents. Astrology, alchemy, mysticism, Gnosis, Kabbalah, theosophy, occultism, New Age, all these are facets that can be found under the umbrella of esotericism. This diversity makes it difficult to give a uniform definition, but it also explains its attraction. People find in it a wide variety of ways to answer their own questions about meaning, knowledge, and transcendence. The tension between secrecy and openness also plays an important role. Many esoteric traditions emphasize that their knowledge must not be revealed to everyone. It is intended only for those who have been prepared, cleansed, or initiated. This idea has contributed to the fact that esotericism has often been perceived as something mysterious, sometimes even dangerous. At the same time, it has always attracted new followers who felt they were part of a special circle that has access to hidden truths. In the modern age, however, this exclusivity has increasingly dissolved. Books, courses, internet forums, and trade fairs make esoteric knowledge accessible to almost everyone today. Esotericism was and is also an alternative to the prevailing rationality. While the Enlightenment and science since the 18th century claimed to explain the world solely with reason and empirical research, esotericism sought what lies beyond these methods. It addresses needs that sober rationality cannot satisfy: the need for wholeness, for meaning, for spiritual experience. Especially in times when social upheavals, technological changes, or crises shake up the worldview, esotericism becomes more attractive. It offers orientation by making hidden connections visible, and it promises access to forces that go beyond the everyday. The boundary between esotericism, religion, and science is often fluid. In antiquity, astrology and alchemy were recognized fields of knowledge that were only later devalued as unscientific. Mysticism in various religions also has strong overlaps with esoteric thinking. In many cases, esotericism can be understood as an attempt to fill the gaps that neither religion nor science can close. Modern research has therefore described the term esotericism not as a clearly defined tradition, but as a category of observation. Historians such as Antoine Favre have tried to determine basic characteristics of esotericism in order to distinguish it from other currents. These include the idea of correspondences between all levels of reality, the emphasis on imagination and mediation through symbols, the experience of the transformation of the human being through secret knowledge, and the idea of a transmission of knowledge by initiates. These criteria make it clear that esotericism is not simply irrational, but follows its own logic, which has exerted a constant fascination for centuries. In the present, esotericism is often viewed critically, especially from the scientific side. She is accused of making unsubstantiated claims, doing pseudoscience, or taking advantage of gullible people. At the same time, the esoteric market is booming. Books, consultations, healing stones, seminars, and online offers achieve billions in sales. Esotericism has become a part of pop culture, ranging from esoteric fairs to lifestyle magazines. This ambivalence, between rejection and fascination, characterizes her position today. Telling the story of esotericism therefore means telling the story of a countercurrent that adapts again and again. It ranges from the mystery cults of antiquity to the secret brotherhoods of the Renaissance and the spiritual movements of the present. It is the story of people who are convinced that behind the visible world there is a hidden truth, and that it is possible to experience this truth through symbols, rituals, meditation, or secret knowledge. Thus, esotericism is not a marginal phenomenon, but an integral part of cultural history. It shows that the need for meaning, for transcendence, and for hidden connections is universal and produces each epoch in its own form. The following chapters of this script will trace the development of esotericism through the centuries, from its beginnings in antiquity to its modern manifestations in the digital age. It will become clear how changeable, but also how persistent the esoteric tradition is, and how it always finds new forms of expression to answer the fundamental questions of man. Chapter 2: Esotericism in Antiquity, Greece, Egypt, and the Mystery Cults. The origins of esotericism can be traced back a long way, to the time when religion, philosophy, and science were not yet clearly separated from each other. In antiquity, faith, observation of nature, mythology, and speculative thinking merged into a worldview in which the mysterious and the obvious went hand in hand. Especially in Greece and Egypt, two of the most important advanced civilizations of the Mediterranean region, a large number of esoteric traditions developed, which were later to become formative for the entire West. In particular, the mystery cults, which, in contrast to the official state cults, were characterized by their secrecy and their initiation rituals, gave esotericism its characteristic form. Ancient Egypt has always been a land full of symbolism and religious significance. The priests saw themselves not only as mediators between humans and gods, but also as keepers of a secret knowledge of the cosmos. In hieroglyphics, buildings, and rituals, this knowledge was passed on in encrypted form. Temples such as those in Luxor or Karnak were not only places of worship, but also schools where priests received secret training. In particular, the art of magic, combined with the knowledge of medicinal plants, astrology, and funerary rituals, was strongly developed in Egypt. The books of the dead, which were to accompany the deceased on their way to the afterlife, contain many indications that the Egyptians had a deep understanding of symbolic language and ritual power. This heritage was later to flow into Greek esotericism. The Greeks adopted from the Egyptians not only individual images of gods and mythical motifs, but also the idea that there is a hidden order behind the visible world. Especially in the 6th and 5th centuries BC, philosophical systems began to be developed that reinterpreted the relationship between man, nature, and the cosmos. Pythagoras of Samos is considered a key figure in this. He was not only a mathematician and philosopher, but also the founder of a secret community that relied on strict rules, ritual purity, and the transmission of a special knowledge. The Pythagoreans believed that the world is based on numbers and harmonies. For them, music, mathematics, and the cosmos were closely linked, and by understanding these connections, man was able to better understand himself and the universe. This thinking, that everything is connected to everything else and that there is a hidden harmony behind appearances, became a cornerstone of later esoteric traditions. In addition to Pythagoras, Orphism also played an important role. The followers of this movement invoked the legendary singer Orpheus, who is said to have descended into the underworld to bring back his lover Eurydice. At the heart of Orphism was the idea that the human soul is of divine origin, but must be imprisoned in a body and purified through repeated rebirths. The goal was to free oneself from this material bond and return to the divine source. This idea of transmigration of souls and spiritual purification was later developed further in Gnosis and Neoplatonism. The so-called mystery cults were widespread in antiquity and were considered a form of secret religious practice that was only accessible to initiates. The best known are the Eleusinian mysteries, which were celebrated in the sanctuary of Eleusis near Athens. They were dedicated to the goddess Demeter and her daughter Persephone and dealt with the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. The initiations were top secret. Anyone who talked about it risked harsh punishments. Nevertheless, it is said that through rituals, fasting, songs, and symbolic acts, the participants had a kind of transcendent experience that gave them comfort in the face of death. For many, This initiation was considered a turning point in life, as it gave the feeling of being initiated into a higher context of meaning. In addition to Eleusis, there were numerous other cults, such as the Dionysia, which worshipped the ecstatic god of wine and fertility, or the mysteries of Isis and Osiris, which came from Egypt to Greece and later to Rome. In the Hellenistic period, Isis, the Egyptian goddess, was stylized as the universal mother goddess who watched over life, death, and rebirth. Their cults promised healing, protection, and spiritual renewal, and they were very popular because they enabled people to have a personal, mystical relationship with the deity, in contrast to the distant state rituals. The connection between philosophy and esotericism became particularly clear in Neoplatonism, which emerged from the 3rd century AD. Plotinus and his disciples taught that the visible world was only a reflection of a higher spiritual reality. Everything emerges from the One, an infinite source to which the soul can return through purification and spiritual absorption. This idea that man has access to a higher reality through inner knowledge became a central motif of later esoteric traditions. Esotericism also found its forms of expression in Rome. Although Roman religion was strongly oriented towards state cults and public rituals, the mystery cults flourished alongside them. Mithras, an originally Persian god, was worshipped in secret circles in the Roman Empire, which were especially popular with soldiers. The Mithraic mysteries included symbolic meals, trials, and initiation stages that promised the initiates a special closeness to the divine. These forms of worship even influenced the early Christian rituals, which also focus on initiation, community, and symbolic feeding. Another central element of ancient esotericism was astrology. The Babylonians had already used stargazing to interpret fates, but in the Greco-Roman world, astrology became a complex system that linked cosmic movements with human life. The idea that the stars influence not only the course of nature, but also the lives of people, was widespread in antiquity. Astrology was by no means just a marginal phenomenon, but was practiced and taken seriously by emperors, politicians, and philosophers. Overall, antiquity shows that esotericism in this epoch was less a counter-movement than an integral part of cultural and religious life. Mystery cults, secret schools, philosophical systems, and religious practices combined to form a worldview that assumed that visible reality was only one part of the whole. Behind the myths, symbols, and rituals was a deeper knowledge that was not open to everyone, but only to those who were willing to be initiated. In this way, antiquity laid the foundations for everything that was later understood by the term esotericism. The idea of secret knowledge, the meaning of symbols and rituals, the idea of the correspondence between macrocosm and microcosm, the hope of salvation through insight, all this was developed and passed on during this time. The later centuries were to take up these ideas, transform them and continue them in new forms. But its roots lie in antiquity, in Egypt, Greece, and Rome, where people first systematically tried to connect the visible world with an invisible, mysterious order. Chapter 3: Hermeticism, Hermes Trismegistos and the Corpus Hermeticum. When talking about the history of esotericism, one inevitably comes across the name Hermes Trismegistos. He is considered a mythical figure, half god, half sage, who was revered as the originator of a secret doctrine that has fascinated generations of philosophers, mystics, and esotericists since ancient times. Hermes Trismegistos, whose name means the thrice greatest Hermes, was thought to be a fusion of the Greek god Hermes with the Egyptian god Thoth. Hermes was the messenger of the gods, the mediator between heaven and earth, god of wisdom and language, while Thoth was considered the god of writing, magic, and science. In this symbiosis, the figure of a universal teacher was created, who revealed the secret knowledge of the gods to people. The teachings attributed to Hermes Trismegistos were collected in the so-called Corpus Hermeticum, a collection of writings that were probably written in Alexandria between the 1st and 3rd centuries AD. Alexandria was a melting pot of cultures, ideas, and religions at that time. Greek philosophy, Egyptian religion, Jewish mysticism, and early Christianity met and influenced each other. It was in this atmosphere that the Hermetic scriptures developed, which, in the form of dialogues between Hermes Trismegistos and his disciples, dealt with fundamental questions of cosmos, soul, and divine knowledge. The Corpus Hermeticum does not contain a systematic philosophy in the modern sense, but a collection of revelation texts that deal with cosmological, theological, and practical topics. The focus is on the idea that the visible world is an expression of a higher spiritual reality. God, the source of everything, is incomprehensible and ineffable, but he reveals himself in creation. Man, as part of this creation, carries the divine light within him and has the opportunity to return to the divine source through inner knowledge and spiritual purification. This striving for Gnosis, for direct knowledge of the divine, forms a central link between Hermeticism and Gnosis. Particularly famous is the Hermetic principle as above, so below, as below, so above, which was handed down in the so-called Tabula Smaragdina, the Emerald Table. This formula expresses the conviction that macrocosm and microcosm, the universe and man, correspond to each other. Everything is interconnected, and those who know the laws of one area can also understand the secrets of the other. This idea shaped the entire Western esotericism and can be found in alchemy, astrology, and modern spirituality. Another important theme of Hermeticism is the idea of the deification of man. Man is not merely a mortal being, but a spiritual being who can transcend the boundaries of the material world through knowledge, purity, and meditation. The Hermetic path does not lead through external rituals, but through inner transformation. For many, this made Hermeticism an attractive alternative to the official religions, which relied more heavily on dogmas and external practices. Hermeticism is also closely linked to alchemy. Even in ancient times, Hermetic texts were combined with alchemical recipes and symbols. Alchemy was not only the search for the transformation of metals, but also a spiritual process in which the purification of matter meant at the same time a purification of man. The fusion of alchemy and Hermeticism led to the Hermetic scriptures being regarded as an authority by alchemists and natural philosophers for centuries. Hermes Trismegistos was considered the forefather of the secret sciences, the guardian of true knowledge, which was not open to everyone. During the Middle Ages, Hermetic writings were largely forgotten in the West, but survived in the Arab world, where they were translated into Arabic and associated with Islamic philosophy and mysticism. The Renaissance saw a rediscovery. The Florentine philosopher Marsilio Ficino translated the Corpus Hermeticum into Latin in 1463. Hermeticism thus became a central source of inspiration for Renaissance philosophy. Many scholars saw Hermes Trismegistos as an ancient sage who lived before Moses and preserved the ancient knowledge of mankind. This idea gave Hermeticism enormous authority. Particularly influential was the idea that Hermeticism embodies a prisca theologia, an ancient theology that underlies all religions. This made it an ideal fit into the Renaissance ideal of harmony between religion, philosophy, and science. Hermetic thinking shaped philosophers such as Giordano Bruno, who saw the divine expression in the infinite multiplicity of worlds, and Paracelsus, who combined the Hermetic tradition with medicine and natural history. Hermeticism also played an important role in Renaissance art and culture. Symbols, number mysticism, and allegorical representations in architecture, painting, and literature carried on Hermetic thoughts. The belief that the universe is structured by secret laws, which can be recognized through study, meditation, and intuition, gave the epoch a special spiritual glow. The effect of Hermeticism did not stop with the Renaissance. In the 17th and 18th centuries, it remained a central point of reference for occultism, Freemasonry, and Rosicrucianism. Even in the Enlightenment, which was critical of everything mysterious, there was a countercurrent in Hermetic ideas that emphasized inner knowledge. Until the 19th century, Hermeticism influenced movements such as theosophy and later the New Age, which took up its symbols and ideas again. Today, Hermes Trismegistos is often seen as an archetypal figure, a symbol of humanity's age-old dream of hidden wisdom. Historically, he is a mythical construction, but in the history of his impact he became a real teacher whose teachings inspired people over 2 millennia. Hermeticism is an example of how esotericism works. It combines religious, philosophical, and scientific elements, it works with symbols and metaphors, and it is aimed at people who believe that there is a deeper truth behind the visible world. Their idea of correspondence, inner transformation, and the connection of microcosm and macrocosm became a basic pattern of esoteric thinking that lives on to this day. Hermes Trismegistos thus stands at the beginning of a tradition that has been constantly reinterpreted, adapted, and continued. Whether as an Egyptian god, Greek sage, Renaissance philosopher, or modern occultist, he embodies the longing for a knowledge that can not only be grasped intellectually, but experienced inwardly. Hermeticism thus forms a central building block in the long history of esotericism, which has had a lasting influence on its further development up to the present day. Chapter 4: Gnosis and Early Christianity, Secret Knowledge and Ideas of Salvation. The rise of Christianity in late antiquity was associated with a current that was to become of decisive importance for the history of esotericism: Gnosis. The term is derived from the Greek gnosis, which means knowledge. However, it was not a purely intellectual knowledge, but a deep, inner knowledge that opened up access to a transcendent reality for the initiated. The Gnostics were convinced that the visible world was not man's true home, but an imperfect, often hostile realm from which the soul had to be freed. For them, salvation meant recognizing the divine light within and thereby returning to the original divine home. The Gnostic movement was not a unified church, but a network of schools, scriptures, and teachers who developed different systems. What they had in common was the idea that the material world was the work of a lesser creator god, whom they often called demiurge. This demiurge stood in contrast to the highest, inaccessible God, who is enthroned above everything and whose light is also reflected in man in individual sparks. The Gnostics' view of man was characterized by a deep duality. The body belonged to the captive, lower world, while the soul was of divine origin. This soul must awaken through cognition, through Gnosis, and become aware of its true origin. The cosmology of the Gnostics was often rich in symbols, myths, and hierarchies. They spoke of emanations, the so-called eons, which emanated from the supreme God and filled the space between divine perfection and the material world. Within these systems, figures such as Sophia, wisdom, played a central role, who had contributed to the origin of the material world through a mistake or fall. Such myths were supposed to explain the state of man, trapped in a lower world, but with the possibility of returning through inner knowledge. Gnosis arose at a time when many religious currents coexisted and influenced each other. Elements from Jewish tradition, Greek philosophy, ancient Near Eastern mythology, and Egyptian religion flowed together. Early Christianity, which also grew in this cultural melting pot, shared some themes with Gnosis, such as the hope of salvation, the importance of the inner man, or the idea of a hidden knowledge accessible only to the initiated. But there were also fundamental differences that soon led to conflicts. Some Gnostic groups saw Jesus as the bearer of this secret knowledge. For them, he was not so much the Redeemer through crucifixion and resurrection, as the nascent church emphasized, but rather a divine teacher who revealed to the elect the truth about their divine origins. Some Gnostic writings, such as the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Philip, which are among the texts discovered in Nag Hammadi in 1945, portray Jesus as a mediator of secret teachings that are not accessible to everyone. Gnosis was thus in direct competition with the emerging church, which proclaimed a universal offer of salvation for all people, not just for an initiated elite. The Church reacted decisively to the challenge of Gnosis. Church fathers such as Irenaeus of Lyon or Tertullian fiercely opposed the Gnostics and described their teachings as heresies. They accused them of falsifying the gospel and despising God's creation. Instead, ecclesiastical theology relied on the goodness of creation and universal redemption through Christ. While the Gnostics saw the body and the material world as a prison, the Church emphasized the resurrection of the flesh and the redemption of all creation. Despite these conflicts, Gnostic elements continued to have an effect in the Christian tradition. Mystical currents within Christianity repeatedly took up ideas that were close to Gnosis, such as the idea of inner knowledge or the emphasis on spiritual transformation. The idea that there is a secret, deeper doctrine in Christianity that is only accessible to initiates has also found resonance again and again. This can be seen, for example, in the writings of Origen or in later Christian mysticism, which was strongly influenced by inner vision and esoteric knowledge. A remarkable aspect of Gnosis is its proximity to other esoteric currents of the time. It was closely related to Hermeticism, which also taught the correspondence between macrocosm and microcosm and emphasized the path of inner knowledge. There are also parallels to Jewish Kabbalah, especially in the idea of emanations and hidden divine structures. In a way, Gnosis can be understood as an interface where religious, philosophical, and esoteric traditions were combined. The importance of Gnosis for the history of esotericism lies not only in its contents, but also in its attitude. She advocated the idea that truth is not only imparted by external teachings, dogmas, or institutions, but by an inner knowledge that man must discover within himself. This idea became a core component of esoteric thinking up to the present day. The idea that salvation or spiritual perfection can be achieved through a secret, inner knowledge can be found in many later currents, from alchemy to theosophy to the New Age. In particular, the discovery of the Nag Hammadi writings in the 20th century has shown how rich and diverse the Gnostic tradition was. These texts, which remained hidden for a long time, provided insight into a world in which mythical narratives, cosmological speculations, and spiritual practices formed a unity. They also made it clear that Gnosis was not simply a lost movement, but a serious expression of the religious search in late antiquity. In retrospect, it becomes clear that Gnosis and early Christianity gave two different answers to the same question. How can man find salvation? While the Church emphasized the path of universal grace, faith, and sacraments, Gnosis saw the key in a secret knowledge that was given only to the elect. Both paths were in tension, but also in interaction with each other. Gnosis was soon pushed back as an organized movement, but its ideas remained alive. They appeared again and again in secret circles, in mystical currents, in the philosophy of the Middle Ages, and in the esoteric movements of modern times. They taught that man is more than just a part of the visible world, that a divine spark burns in him, waiting to return home. This image, as old as it may be, has never lost its appeal, and it still shapes many people's longing for knowledge that lies beyond the obvious. Chapter 5: Neoplatonism and the Philosophy of the Hidden. Neoplatonism is considered one of the most influential philosophical currents of late antiquity and is of importance for the history of esotericism that can hardly be overestimated. Not only did it represent an evolution of Platonic philosophy, but it combined Greek thought with religious, mystical, and esoteric elements to create a system that was both intellectually sophisticated and spiritually fascinating. The focus was on the conviction that the visible world is not the ultimate goal of human knowledge, but that behind it lies an invisible, divine reality to which man can return. This idea was based on Platonic ideas, but developed them further in a form that was to have a deep effect on the later traditions of mysticism, theology, and esotericism. The founder of Neoplatonism was Plotinus, who worked in Rome in the 3rd century AD. His writings, which were collected in the so-called Enneads, formed the basis of this philosophy. Plotinus taught that there is a supreme origin, which he called the One. This One is infinite, perfect, and beyond all human concepts. It is neither conceivable nor describable, but can only be experienced through an immediate, mystical union. From the One emerge all the other levels of reality, first the spirit, nous, which represents Plato's world of ideas, then the world soul, which establishes the connection between the spiritual and the material world, and finally the material world itself, which is considered the most distant and imperfect radiation of the One. This hierarchical structure of the cosmos was formative for many esoteric traditions. She made it clear that the visible world is only a reflection of a higher reality and that man, as part of this order, can find the way back to the origin within himself. For Plotinus, the goal of man was gnosis, the union with the One. This path led through inner purification, philosophical knowledge, meditation, and the overcoming of sensual bonds. Man should turn away from the material world and elevate his soul through contemplative contemplation. Neoplatonism, however, was not only a philosophy of inner vision, but also a cosmological interpretation of the world. Everything in creation is an expression of the One, and therefore everything is connected. This idea of correspondences and connections between the different levels of being would later play a central role in Hermeticism, alchemy, and Kabbalah. Thinking in symbols, hierarchies, and emanations became an integral part of the esoteric tradition. It is particularly interesting how Neoplatonism combined philosophy and religion. Plotinus himself was not a religious founder, but his successors such as Porphyrios, Iamblichos, and Proclus increasingly integrated religious practices and rituals into the philosophical system. Iamblichos, for example, emphasized the importance of theurgy, i.e. the sacred acts through which man can come into contact with the divine powers. For him, pure philosophical knowledge was not enough. Ritual practices were needed to unite the soul with the gods. This combination of philosophy and ritual is a typical characteristic of esoteric thinking and was later to recur in many currents. The influence of Neoplatonism on early Christianity was enormous. Many church fathers, including Augustine, were influenced by the reading of the Enneads. Even though Augustine reinterpreted the doctrine of the One in a Christian way, the idea of an inner, mystical union with God remained a core point of his theology. The idea that God is beyond all concepts and can only be experienced in contemplation pervades all Christian mysticism, from the Desert Fathers to Meister Eckhart to the mystics of modern times. At the same time, the Gnostics and later the Kabbalists adopted numerous concepts of emanations and hierarchies. But Neoplatonism was not only formative for Christianity. It also found an echo in Islamic and Jewish philosophy. Philosophers such as Avicenna or Maimonides took up Neoplatonic ideas to deepen their theologies. As a result, Neoplatonism became a bridge between the great monotheistic religions and the esoteric traditions that developed in parallel. Another important element of Neoplatonism was symbolic language. Since the One lies beyond language, metaphors, images, and parables were used to describe it, at least in hints. This symbolic mode of expression was to become fundamental for esotericism, which to this day works heavily with images, allegories, and metaphors. Symbols became mediators between the visible and the invisible, between man and the divine. In the practical field, Neoplatonism also had an impact on magic. The theurgy that Iamblichos and his disciples developed understood magical acts not as a manipulation of the forces of nature, but as a sacred practice that brought man into harmony with the divine order. Rituals, prayers, meditations, and incantations were seen as a means of purifying the soul and seeking closeness to the divine. Neoplatonism thus laid the foundation for those forms of sacred magic that were taken up again in the Renaissance and combined with Hermetic and Kabbalistic ideas. In retrospect, it can be said that Neoplatonism represents the philosophy of the hidden. He combined rational thinking with mystical experience, cosmological speculation with religious practice. His teachings represented a synthesis that preserved the intellectual heritage of antiquity and at the same time gave an outlook on the spiritual developments of the coming centuries. Without Neoplatonism, esotericism as we know it would hardly be conceivable. His influence reached far into the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. In Florence, Plotinus was retranslated by Marsilio Ficino in the 15th century, and his ideas were incorporated into the philosophy, art, and esotericism of the time. The idea of a secret, hidden truth that lies behind the apparitions became a cornerstone of Renaissance humanism and inspired thinkers such as Giordano Bruno and Pico della Mirandola. Neoplatonism thus not only shaped an epoch, but created a way of thinking that remained effective for centuries. He embodies the essence of esoteric thinking, the conviction that the visible world is not the ultimate reality, that man can reach a higher truth through inner knowledge and spiritual practice, and that symbols, rituals, and meditation are ways to make this truth tangible. Neoplatonism is thus far more than a philosophical school of late antiquity. It is a key to understanding the entire esoteric tradition that has invoked it again and again, whether in mysticism, alchemy, Hermeticism, or modern occultism. The philosophy of the hidden, as formulated by Plotinus and his successors, remains a shining example of how deeply man's longing for the invisible, for the divine, and for a return to the origin is rooted in intellectual history. Chapter 6: Esotericism in the Middle Ages, Alchemy, Astrology, and Kabbalah. The Middle Ages are often seen as a time when the Christian Church dominated intellectual life and there was little room for alternative ideas. But a closer look reveals that it was precisely in this epoch that the foundations for many esoteric traditions were laid or further developed. In the field of tension between Christian theology, ancient heritage, and new influences from the Arab-Islamic world, currents emerged that built a bridge between philosophy, religion, and occult sciences. Alchemy, astrology, and Kabbalah in particular played a central role. They not only shaped the intellectual culture of the Middle Ages, but also became supporting pillars of Western esotericism. Alchemy is considered one of the most important esoteric disciplines of that time. At first glance, she was concerned with the transformation of metals, with the search for the philosopher's stone, which was supposed to transform base metals into gold and at the same time give immortality. But this practical side was only a partial aspect. In truth, alchemy was also a spiritual system that started from the conviction that external and internal processes correspond to each other. The purification of metals reflected the purification of the soul. The transformation of matter was at the same time a transformation of man. Alchemical writings are therefore often full of symbols, metaphors, and images that can be read ambiguously. A laboratory experiment could also be a spiritual parable. The alchemy of the Middle Ages was strongly influenced by ancient and Arabic sources. Works by scholars such as Zosimos of Panopolis or Jabir ibn Hayyan reached Europe via Spain and Sicily. The translations of these texts aroused an enormous interest in the occult sciences. Monasteries, universities, and princely courts became places where alchemical experiments were conducted. Famous personalities such as Albertus Magnus or Roger Bacon dealt with alchemical questions, trying to combine observation of nature and spiritual interpretation. Alchemy was more than just a precursor to modern chemistry. It was imbued with esoteric thinking. Matter was not considered a dead substance, but a living expression of a hidden order. Everything in nature had an inner core, a forma or spiritus that could be recognized and transformed. The philosopher's stone was therefore not only a chemical substance, but a symbol of the unity of spirit and matter, of man and cosmos. In addition to alchemy, astrology played a prominent role. It had already been a respected science in antiquity, and in the Middle Ages it became an integral part of scholarship. Universities taught astrology, rulers sought advice from astrologers, and even church dignitaries used astrological calculations, although the church was often officially critical. The basic idea of astrology, that the movements of the stars influence earthly life, corresponded to medieval thinking in correspondences. Man was a microcosm that reflected the order of the macrocosm. In the Middle Ages, astrology was not just fortune-telling, but a complex system of interpreting nature. Horoscopes were not only used to determine the fate of individuals, but also to plan political decisions, healing methods, or agricultural cycles. Medical astrology, also known as iatromathematics, connected the constellations of the stars with the bodily fluids and diseases. Doctors such as Paracelsus, who worked in the transition to the modern era, drew on astrological knowledge to make diagnoses and develop healing methods. The astrology of the Middle Ages was strongly intertwined with theology. Many scholars emphasized that while the stars exerted influences, they did not determine free will. In this way, an attempt was made to reconcile astrology with Christian teaching. At the same time, however, it retained the idea that the universe is a meaningful whole, ordered by rules, whose secrets can be deciphered. A third central current was the Kabbalah, which developed its classical form in the 12th and 13th centuries in southern France and Spain. Kabbalah is a mystical tradition within Judaism that assumes that the Torah contains not only an obvious meaning, but also a hidden, secret meaning. Through number mysticism, symbolism, and meditation, Kabbalists tried to decipher this deeper meaning. At the center of Kabbalah is the doctrine of the 10 Sephirot, the emanations of God, which are at the same time aspects of the divine nature and structures of creation. The Sephirot form the tree of life, which serves as a symbol for the order of the universe. Through meditation, prayer, and contemplative exercises, Kabbalists could try to enter into this divine order and achieve union with God. Kabbalah was not only a Jewish tradition, but also influenced Christian thinkers who tried to connect the teachings with Christian theology in so-called Christian Kabbalism. Figures such as Giovanni Pico della Mirandola saw in the Kabbalah a confirmation of Christian doctrine and made it a component of Renaissance esotericism. But even in the Middle Ages, Kabbalah was perceived as an expression of a deeper, secret knowledge that was accessible only to a few initiates. Alchemy, astrology, and Kabbalah had many similarities despite their differences. All three assumed a hidden order that was hidden behind the visible appearances of the world. They worked with symbols, metaphors, and numbers to describe this order. And they combined practical knowledge, be it about metals, stars, or sacred texts, with spiritual goals such as knowledge, redemption, or transformation. In doing so, they embodied the essence of esoteric thinking in the Middle Ages. It is remarkable how strongly these disciplines shaped cultural life. Rulers based their policies on astrological advice, scholars experimented with alchemical procedures in laboratories, rabbis and mystics developed Kabbalistic systems that had an effect far beyond Judaism. Even though the church occasionally took action against individual practices, they could never be completely suppressed because they were deeply rooted in people's minds. In retrospect, it becomes clear that the Middle Ages were by no means a dark time without intellectual development, but an epoch of intensive confrontation with the hidden forces of the cosmos. Alchemy led to important scientific findings, astrology shaped the worldview and medicine, and Kabbalah opened up new ways of spiritual interpretation. Together, they laid the foundations for the flowering of esotericism that was to follow in the Renaissance. The Middle Ages thus show a special dialectic. On the one hand, the church dominated and excluded heretical teachings. On the other hand, the pursuit of secret knowledge flourished precisely during this time. In this tension, an esotericism developed that both built on old traditions and opened up new paths, and which continues to have an effect today. Chapter 7. The Rosicrucians, Secret Brotherhoods and Their Myths. In the early 17th century, a movement emerged in Europe that still fires the imagination of esotericists, historians, and writers today, the Rosicrucians. They are an example of how much myths, legends, and secret traditions can interweave in esotericism, making it difficult to separate historical facts from literary constructions. The Rosicrucians embody the ideal of a secret brotherhood that has hidden knowledge and passes it on only to the elect. At the same time, they reflect the intellectual atmosphere of the early 17th century, a time full of upheavals, religious conflicts, and scientific discoveries. The history of the Rosicrucians begins with a series of writings published in Germany between 1614 and 1616. The Forma Fraternitatis, the Confessio Fraternitatis, and the Cheimisch Hochzeit des Christian Rosenkreuz. These texts described the existence of a secret brotherhood, which had supposedly been founded in the Middle Ages and whose members had special knowledge of nature, religion, and philosophy. They were to work in secret to renew the world and usher in a new era of knowledge. At the center of the legend was the figure of Christian Rosenkreuz, a mysterious sage who is said to have lived in the 14th century. According to legend, Rosenkreuz undertook a long journey to the Orient, where he learned secret knowledge in Egypt, Arabia, and Persia, which he later brought to Europe. On his return, he founded a brotherhood dedicated to healing, spiritual renewal, and the search for divine wisdom. His tomb is said to have been discovered centuries later, well-ordered and full of symbols, an indication that he was more than an ordinary person, perhaps an initiate or even an immortal. The Rosicrucian writings were full of symbolism and allegorical language. Especially the Cheimisch Hochzeit by Johann Valentin Andry is often read as a kind of alchemical novel. In a mixture of dream, allegory, and narrative, she depicts a mystical wedding full of trials, riddles, and symbols. Many saw it as an encoded representation of the inner transformation of the human being, similar to how in alchemy the transformation of lead into gold was considered a metaphor for the purification of the soul. The publication of the Rosicrucian texts triggered an enormous echo in Europe. Scholars, theologians, and occultists wondered whether this brotherhood really existed. Some feverishly searched for clues, others wrote tracts about the Rosicrucians themselves in order to get in touch with them. At a time when Europe was marked by religious wars, sectarian divisions, and political uncertainty, the idea of a secret community that possessed superior knowledge and wanted to lead humanity to a new level seemed particularly tempting. The Rosicrucians stood in the context of the intellectual currents of their time. Humanism, the Reformation, and early science had changed thinking, and many were looking for a synthesis between faith and knowledge, religion, and science. The Rosicrucians embodied this ideal. They combined alchemical and astrological ideas with Christian mysticism. They called for a reform of religion and society, and they saw themselves as guardians of a secret knowledge that would lead humanity into a new era. Whether the Rosicrucians actually existed as an organized brotherhood is still disputed today. Many historians assume that the early writings were more literary fictions, perhaps intended as a call for intellectual renewal. Johann Valentin Andry himself, the author of The Chemical Wedding, later distanced himself and called his work a comedy. Nevertheless, over time, groups developed that saw themselves as Rosicrucians and turned the legend into reality. In the 18th century, the Rosicrucians experienced a new heyday. During this time, in which Freemasonry also rose, numerous secret societies were formed that invoked the Rosicrucian tradition. Especially in Germany and France, societies were formed that combined alchemical experiments, magical rituals, and Christian mystical teachings. Rosicrucians and Freemasons often overlapped during this era, and some lodges integrated Rosicrucian rites into their structures. The Rosicrucians influenced not only esotericism, but also the history of science. Many natural philosophers saw themselves in their tradition by combining natural research and spiritual search. Alchemy was also further cultivated in Rosicrucian circles, whereby it was increasingly understood as a symbolic language. Gold was not only seen as a metal, but as a symbol of perfection that had to be discovered in man himself. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the Rosicrucians experienced another wave of rediscovery. Movements such as theosophy or occultism took up their symbols and myths. Secret societies such as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn or modern Rosicrucian orders such as the Amorc, Antiquus Mysticus Ordo Rosi Crucis invoked the old tradition and developed their own systems of teaching, ritual, and symbolism. The fascination of the Rosicrucians lies in their complexity to this day. They are a myth that inseparably combines historical reality, literary fiction, and esoteric symbolism. Her writings speak of secret knowledge, of a hidden brotherhood, of journeys to distant lands, and of the possibility of transforming the world. They embody the esoteric ideal par excellence, that there is an invisible community of initiates who secretly guide the fate of humanity and hold the keys to a deeper truth. The Rosicrucians are therefore not only a historical phenomenon, but also a symbol of the eternal striving for a higher wisdom. Whether they are seen as a real organization or as a literary myth, their impact is unbroken. They have captured the imagination of generations, they have inspired scientists, artists, and occultists, and they are an integral part of that esoteric tradition that focuses on the invisible, the mysterious, and the transformative. Thus, the history of the Rosicrucians remains a mirror for the essence of esotericism itself, a mixture of reality and myth, of symbol and truth, of secret tradition and public impact. Their form shows how much the need for hidden knowledge and spiritual renewal has shaped the cultural history of Europe, and how this longing continues to have an effect today. Chapter 8: Renaissance and Rediscovery of Esoteric Traditions. The Renaissance marked one of the great periods of upheaval in European intellectual history. It was not only the rediscovery of antiquity in art, science, and philosophy, but also an epoch in which esoteric traditions that had been buried for centuries or had only been handed down in fragments once again became the focus of interest. During this time, a new attitude flourished that understood man as creator, researcher, and mediator between nature and the divine. Humanism, science, and esotericism combined in a unique way, and from this connection arose ideas that shape both intellectual history and spiritual search to this day. A crucial place for the rediscovery of esoteric traditions was Florence. Marsilio Ficino, an important humanist and philosopher, worked there, who translated the Corpus Hermeticum from Greek into Latin on behalf of the Medici. This collection of Hermetic writings, attributed to Hermes Trismegistos, had remained largely unknown in Europe until then. Its publication in 1463 triggered a wave of enthusiasm. It was believed that the Hermetic texts were the oldest knowledge of mankind, even older than the writings of Moses. They were seen as a Prisca Theologia, an ancient, pure theology that connected all religions and gave people access to a universal truth. Ficino combined Hermeticism with Platonic thought and developed the so-called Neoplatonism of the Renaissance. He saw the cosmos as permeated by divine harmony and regarded music, astrology, and magic as legitimate means of recognizing and using this harmony. His philosophy was profoundly esoteric, because it was based on the idea that man could return to harmony with the divine order through knowledge and inner transformation. Another important thinker was Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. With his famous speech on the dignity of man of 1486, he emphasized that man has the unique freedom to shape his own being. Pico was a passionate collector of knowledge, studying not only Christian, but also Jewish and Arabic texts. He was particularly fascinated by Kabbalah, which he regarded as the key to deciphering divine secrets. He combined Jewish mysticism with Christian theology and saw in it a confirmation of Christianity through the true wisdom of Kabbalah. This so-called Christian Kabbalism became a central component of Renaissance esotericism. The rediscovery of Kabbalah, Hermeticism, and Neoplatonism led to a new appreciation of magic and astrology. Magic was not understood as a dark practice, but as natural magic, the art of recognizing the hidden forces of nature and using them in harmony with the divine order. This form of magic was not in opposition to religion, but was supposed to be in harmony with it. Astrology flourished in that it was understood as an instrument to make visible the harmony between heaven and earth. In the Renaissance, the cosmos was seen as a living organism in which everything was interconnected, a thought that stemmed directly from Hermetic and Neoplatonic thought. Alchemy also received new impulses during this time. Although it remained a secret science in many aspects, it was increasingly understood as a philosophical and spiritual system. The transformation of base metals into gold was considered a mirror for the transformation of the human soul. The philosopher's stone became a symbol of perfection and unity. Numerous alchemists combined their experiments with mystical writings in which symbols, allegories, and images described the inner processes of transformation. This epoch also shows the increasing connection between esotericism and art. Artists such as Leonardo da Vinci and Albrecht Dürer dealt intensively with symbolism, proportions, and hidden meanings. Architecture, painting, and music were understood as expressions of cosmic harmony. Cathedrals, palaces, and paintings are full of symbols that refer to a hidden order. Art became the medium of esoteric messages, which are encoded in geometric shapes, colors, and allegorical representations. Another strand of Renaissance esotericism was the influence of Arab and Islamic scholars. Translations of texts from Andalusia and the Middle East brought the knowledge of philosophers such as Avicenna, Averroes, or the alchemist Geber, Jabir ibn Hayyan, to Europe. Aristotle associated these texts with mysticism, medicine with astrology, and mathematics with magic. The Renaissance thus became a time in which different cultures met in an esoteric discourse. The fascination with secret knowledge was also evident in the founding of secret societies. Although the Rosicrucians were not the focus of attention until the 17th century, their ideas are rooted in the Renaissance. The idea that there are hidden communities of initiates who have special knowledge and work in secret to renew the world found its breeding ground in this epoch. It is important to emphasize that esotericism was not on the fringes in the Renaissance, but at the center of intellectual life. Many of the most important thinkers, artists, and rulers were interested in Hermetic, Kabbalistic, or astrological ideas. The Medici in Florence promoted Ficino and Pico, Emperor Rudolf II in Prague turned his court into a center of alchemy, and even popes employed astrologers. Esotericism was not a counter-movement at this time, but an integral part of the cultural flowering. At the same time, this development also met with resistance. The Church watched the esoteric currents with suspicion, especially when they crossed the line into heresy. Pico della Mirandola's theses were critically examined by Rome. Giordano Bruno, who taught an infinite world with countless living planets and radically continued Hermetic thinking, was finally burned as a heretic in 1600. These conflicts show that esotericism had a powerful effect in the Renaissance, but was always in a field of tension with the established institutions. In retrospect, the Renaissance becomes visible as an epoch in which esotericism, science, and religion interpenetrated each other. The rediscovery of Hermetic, Kabbalistic, and alchemical traditions created a new worldview in which man was not only a viewer, but an active designer of the cosmos. This worldview inspired philosophers, artists, and scientists alike and prepared the ground for many currents of the modern era. The Renaissance made esotericism a central spiritual force again. It combined old wisdom with new thinking, it placed man at the center of the universe and opened the way for him to find a deeper truth through knowledge, art, and magic. In this way, it became the link between the medieval world of religious symbolism and the modern world, in which esotericism was supposed to exist as an alternative to rationality. Chapter 9: Theosophy of the 18th Century, Occultism in Europe. The 18th century is generally regarded as the age of Enlightenment, characterized by rationality, reason, and trust in the natural sciences. But while philosophers such as Voltaire, Rousseau, or Kant formulated the foundations of a modern society on the basis of reason and human rights, an esoteric counter-movement flourished at the same time, which expressed itself in secret societies, mystical teaching systems, and occult practices. This movement was not simply a relic from the Middle Ages, but it took on new forms that moved in a field of tension between Enlightenment and esotericism. Theosophy in particular, understood as a doctrine that claims divine knowledge beyond rational knowledge, played a central role during this time. It is important to emphasize that the term theosophy does not mean the same in the 18th century as it did in the second half of the 19th century, when Helena Blavatsky founded the Theosophical Society. Rather, it was understood at the time to be a tradition that went back to the German mystic Jacob Boehme. Boehme, a simple shoemaker from Görlitz, had visions of divine revelation in the early 17th century, which he recorded in numerous writings. For him, the world was a mirror of the divine process, and man could gain access to this hidden order through inner knowledge. His works combined Christian mysticism with alchemical and astrological symbols and were passed down through generations of theosophists. In the 18th century, numerous scholars, mystics, and occultists drew on Boehme's ideas and developed complex systems from them. Especially in Germany and France, theosophical circles emerged that were based on the conviction that the Enlightenment alone was not enough to understand the nature of man. While the Enlightenment emphasized external progress, the theosophists were looking for inner renewal. They saw in man a divine being who could find his way back to original unity through meditation, prayer, and work on himself. The theosophy of the 18th century was closely related to alchemy and Kabbalah. Alchemical texts continued to be read, but increasingly interpreted symbolically. The melting of metals was considered a parable for inner purification, the philosopher's stone as an image of union with God. Kabbalah provided theosophists with a language of numbers, letters, and emanations that allowed creation to be understood as an ordered structure of divine forces. The Christian Kabbalah in particular found followers at this time, who saw in it a bridge between Jewish mysticism and Christian faith. An outstanding representative of this direction was the French mystic Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin, who was often referred to as the unknown philosopher. He was strongly influenced by Boehme and developed a doctrine that aimed at the inner transformation of the human being. For Saint Martin, it was not decisive to perform external rituals or magical practices, but to turn inwardly to God. This emphasis on inner spirituality distinguished him from other currents that relied more heavily on rituals and secret societies. In addition to Saint Martin, the so-called Martinists also played a role, a movement that carried on his teachings. In France, theosophical and Masonic currents were combined, and lodges arose in which spiritual teachings, rituals, and symbolism were cultivated. Freemasonry itself, which spread enormously throughout Europe in the 18th century, was closely related to esoteric traditions. Although it was officially an ethical humanistic brotherhood, many lodges adopted elements from the Kabbalah, Alchemy, or Rosicrucian writings. The Rosicrucians themselves reappeared in the 18th century, after they had caused a stir in the 17th century with their mysterious manifestos. Rosicrucian societies were formed in Germany, which invoked the reform of religion, science, and society. Especially in the environment of the Gold and Rosicrucian lodges, alchemical experiments were associated with Christian mysticism and political influence. In these circles, theosophical teachings merged with ritual structures reminiscent of Masonic lodges. The fascination with occultism in the 18th century was not a contradiction to the Enlightenment, but a reaction to it. Many people found the purely rational worldview too sober and soulless. They were looking for a deeper, spiritual dimension that reason could not explain. This longing showed the need for wholeness, for a worldview that embedded nature, man, and God in a greater order. Theosophy and occultism offered just that, an alternative view in which symbols, myths, and rituals played a central role. The influence of these currents on the literature and art of the time is also interesting. Numerous writers, musicians, and artists were inspired by esoteric ideas. The German poet Novalis, one of the most important representatives of early Romanticism, was deeply influenced by Boehme's theosophy. He saw poetry as a means of making the hidden connections of the world visible. Goethe also dealt with alchemy, astrology, and mysticism and integrated many of these elements into his work Faust. The theosophy of the 18th century was also a link between the medieval and early modern esoteric traditions and the modern movements of the 19th century. Without her, Helena Blavatsky's Theosophical Society would not have been conceivable. Many of the themes that Blavatsky later took up, the idea of ancient wisdom, the connection between East and West, the emphasis on the hidden dimensions of reality, were already alive in the 18th century. At the same time, the century was marked by the ambivalence between reason and mystery. While the Enlightenment tried to dispel the darkness of superstition, secret circles, lodges, and brotherhoods flourished underground, guarding the light of hidden knowledge. This tension made the 18th century a particularly fruitful epoch for esotericism. In retrospect, it becomes clear that theosophy of the 18th century was far more than a marginal phenomenon. It was part of a broad movement that sought to combine spirituality and reason, to see nature not only as a mechanical system but as a living expression of divine forces, and which recognized in man more than just a thinking mind. It was an expression of the eternal search for the hidden that runs through the history of esotericism, and which took on new form in the 18th century. Chapter 10: Freemasons, Secret Societies, and the Enlightenment. The Age of Enlightenment in the 18th century is often seen as the beginning of a rational modernity in which reason, science, and human rights took center stage. But it was precisely during this time that secret societies, occult circles, and mystical associations experienced an unimagined blossoming. The best known and still the most influential of these associations is Freemasonry, which spread throughout Europe and later over the world in the 18th century. Alongside it, numerous other secret societies emerged that invoked esoteric traditions, from the Rosicrucians to the Illuminati. These currents embodied a peculiar tension. On the one hand, they were part of enlightened thought, promoting education, tolerance, and fraternity, and on the other hand, they guarded secret rituals and symbols that were deeply rooted in the esoteric tradition. Freemasonry in its modern form originated in England at the beginning of the 18th century. In 1717, the first Grand Lodge was founded in London, and from there the movement quickly spread across the continent. Their origins lie in the medieval builders' lodges, in which stonemasons were organized. These artisan associations developed into a symbolic brotherhood that was no longer limited to the building trade, but welcomed people from different classes and professions. However, the master-builder tradition remained central. Symbols such as compasses, square measures, or temple construction served as allegories for the work on one's own inner temple, the moral and spiritual perfection of man. The Masonic rituals and symbols had an esoteric character from the beginning. Admission to the lodge took place through initiations in which the candidate underwent symbolic tests. The lodge was understood as a sacred space in which the members participated in the knowledge of a higher knowledge. The Freemasons saw themselves as part of a tradition that goes back to the mystery cults of antiquity and the builders' huts of the Temple of Solomon. Even if these historical references were more mythical than real, they gave Freemasonry an aura of mystery that continues to have an effect today. The Enlightenment provided fertile ground for Freemasonry. Their values, reason, tolerance, freedom, and fraternity, corresponded to the spirit of the time. Many important personalities of the 18th century, including Voltaire, Mozart, Lessing, Goethe, and Benjamin Franklin, were Freemasons. Nobles, scholars, merchants, and artists met in the lodges, regardless of class and religion. Thus, Freemasonry offered a space in which the ideals of the Enlightenment could be lived in practice. At the same time, these ideals were combined with esoteric symbolism and ritualized practice. In addition to the Freemasons, numerous other secret societies appeared in the 18th century. The Rosicrucians in particular, who had already caused a stir in the 17th century with their mysterious manifestos, experienced a revival. In Germany and France, societies arose that saw themselves as Rosicrucians and combined alchemical, theosophical, and mystical teachings with Masonic structures. The Gold and Rosicrucians, for example, saw themselves as guardians of a secret wisdom, which they passed on through strict initiation rites and symbolic teachings. They were in close contact with Freemasons and influenced their rituals. The Illuminati, founded in 1776 by Adam Weishaupt in Ingolstadt, are also among the best-known secret societies of that time. Unlike the Rosicrucians, they placed less emphasis on mysticism, but emphasized political and social reforms. But they also made use of the symbolic language and secrecy that was typical of esoteric societies. Their goal was to create a better society through education and reason, free from church and state paternalism. The Illuminati thus combined Enlightenment ideals with the structure of a secret society, an approach that made them appear both intriguing and threatening. The existence of such associations aroused the suspicion of the authorities. Governments and churches feared that secret societies would forge conspiracies and undermine the existing order. The Catholic Church in particular saw Freemasonry as a competition, as it united people of different faiths in a kind of universal temple and eluded church control. In 1738, Pope Clement XII condemned the Freemasons in a bull, and this attitude persisted in the Church into the 20th century. Secular rulers also viewed the secret societies with skepticism, fearing that political plans were being forged there. The fascination with secret societies in the 18th century is closely related to the cultural climate of the time. The Enlightenment awakened a new need for education, for knowledge, and for social renewal. At the same time, the longing for the mysterious, for a knowledge that went beyond mere reason, remained. Secret societies such as the Freemasons or Rosicrucians combined both. They offered a space for intellectual exchange, social reform ideas, and at the same time for the cultivation of symbols, rituals, and mysteries. The literature of this era also took up the secret society theme. Friedrich Schiller's The Robbers contains allusions to secret societies, and Goethe's Wilhelm Meister reflects Masonic structures. Mozart, himself a Freemason, composed The Magic Flute, a work that is full of Masonic symbolism. Trials, wisdom, light and darkness, all these are motifs taken from the symbolic language of the lodges. The secret societies of the 18th century decisively shaped the image of esotericism. They showed that esoteric knowledge lived not only in books or individual practices, but also in social structures, in brotherhoods that saw themselves as guardians of a special knowledge. This form of organization later became a model for many esoteric movements of the 19th and 20th centuries, from the Theosophical Society to occult orders such as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. In retrospect, it becomes clear that the Enlightenment did not mean the overcoming of esotericism, but rather its transformation. While the sciences became more rational and distanced themselves from magical ideas, an esoteric culture developed in parallel, which relied on symbols, rituals, and secret knowledge. Freemasons and other secret societies combined the ideals of the Enlightenment with the fascination of mystery. They embodied a double movement. They were children of reason and at the same time guardians of the hidden. This shows that the history of esotericism in the 18th century was not in opposition to the Enlightenment, but was intertwined with it. The Freemasons and secret societies are an impressive example of how deeply the need for community, ritual, and secret knowledge was anchored even in an era that saw itself as rational and enlightened. This need has survived to this day, and the symbols, rituals, and legends of Freemasonry have long since become part of cultural memory, a legacy of the Enlightenment that has at the same time preserved its mystery. Chapter 11. The 19th century, Spiritism and Seances. The 19th century was marked by far-reaching social and scientific upheavals. The Industrial Revolution fundamentally changed people's lives. New technologies such as railways, telegraphs, and electricity opened up unimagined possibilities, and the natural sciences made enormous progress. At the same time, this development led to a feeling of alienation. The world was increasingly rationalized, and many people were looking for access to something that went beyond the purely material. It was in this atmosphere that Spiritism was born, a movement that promised to establish contact with the invisible world of the dead. Spiritism and seances became a mass phenomenon that gripped wide circles of society and evoked both fascination and criticism. The beginnings of modern Spiritism can be traced back to the so-called Fox sisters. In 1848, Sisters Margaret and Kate Fox of Hydesville, New York, reported hearing mysterious knocking noises in their home, supposedly from a ghost. They developed a system in which the spirits could answer questions by knocking on the door. These apparitions spread like wildfire, and soon people flocked to attend the sessions. Newspapers reported, and the Fox sisters became stars of a movement that spread rapidly in the United States and later in Europe. Spiritism struck a chord with the times. The 19th century was an era of scientific curiosity, and many saw the seances as a kind of experimental religion. If the natural sciences could gain knowledge about the material world through experimentation, it was hoped to find evidence of life after death in a similar way. Seances were therefore often carried out like experiments. Ghosts were supposed to appear, give knocking signals, move objects, or express themselves through the media. The role of the media was central to this. People who were particularly sensitive to contact with the spirit world and served as mediators were considered mediums. Media put themselves into a trance, spoke in foreign voices, wrote down messages, or made physical phenomena such as the floating of tables possible. Famous media outlets such as Daniel Dunglas Home, who was supposedly able to soar through the air, or Eusapia Palladino, which caused a stir in Europe, were celebrated by admirers and criticized by skeptics. The fascination with Spiritism extended across all social classes. In the USA and England, seances took place not only in bourgeois living rooms, but also in exclusive salons and even in royal houses. Queen Victoria is said to have been interested in spiritistic sessions herself, and in France Allan Kardec was intensively involved with the phenomenon. Kardec is considered the founder of Spiritism in the narrower sense. In his writings, such as the Book of Spirits, 1857, he developed a doctrine that assumed that the souls of the deceased could continue to exist, develop, and communicate with the living. Kardec combined this teaching with moral and philosophical aspects. Life is a school in which the soul grows through experience and prepares itself for higher levels. Spiritism was not only a religious or esoteric phenomenon, but also a cultural one. It offered comfort at a time when the death rate from disease, war, and accident was high. Many people who had lost loved ones sought contact and confirmation that their loved ones continued to exist in seances. Spiritism thus became a kind of religion of mourning that made the loss more bearable. At the same time, it suited the democratic spirit of the 19th century. Anyone could take part in a seance, and anyone could theoretically become a medium themselves. The popularity of Spiritism also led to scientific debate. Societies for psychic research were founded, such as the Society for Psychical Research in London, 1882, which dealt with the systematic study of ghostly apparitions, telepathy, and other paranormal phenomena. Important scientists such as the evolutionary biologist Alfred Russel Wallace or the chemist William Crookes also dealt with Spiritism and saw it as a serious field of research. Even Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, was an avid spiritualist and defended the authenticity of numerous phenomena. But Spiritism attracted just as much criticism. Skeptics repeatedly proved that many alleged ghost phenomena were based on tricks, fraud, or suggestion. Revelations about media that created their effects with hidden wires, magnets, or clever manipulations undermined the credibility of the movement. The Fox sisters themselves later confessed that their knocking marks had been produced by the cracking of their ankles, although they later retracted this confession. Despite such scandals, the fascination with Spiritism remained unbroken. Spiritism was also part of the larger esoteric currents of the 19th century. He combined himself with theosophy, occultism, and magnetism. Mesmerism, named after Franz Anton Mesmer, had already spread the idea in the 18th century that there were invisible forces that permeated humans and could be influenced by animal magnetism. Spiritualists took up this idea and combined it with contacts with the spirit world. The literature of the time also reflected the fascination. Numerous novels, poems, and plays took up the theme of ghosts and seances. Romanticism had already played with ghostly apparitions, but in the 19th century this took on a new dimension through Spiritism. Even in the visual arts, depictions of seances, mediums, and floating figures were created, blurring the boundary between reality and illusion. It is particularly noteworthy that Spiritism also had a political dimension. In the USA, he associated himself with movements such as the women's rights movement and abolitionism. Many media were women, and the seances offered them a stage on which to speak and work, in a society that otherwise allowed women little public voice. The combination of Spiritism and social reform made the movement a part of cultural progress in the 19th century. In retrospect, it becomes clear that Spiritualism was not simply a fad, but a symptom of deeper longings and fears. It reflected the desire for scientific confirmation of the afterlife, coping with grief in a time of high mortality, and the search for meaning in an increasingly industrialized and rationalized world. At the same time, he prepared the ground for many esoteric currents of the 20th century, which also worked with the idea that invisible forces and hidden dimensions were real and could be experienced. Spiritism had a lasting influence on the cultural life of the 19th century. Even though many of his phenomena have been exposed as deception, he remains a striking example of how strong the longing for contact with the invisible was in an era that saw itself as rational and scientific. He was part of the other Enlightenment that did not focus on the destruction of the mystery, but on its exploration, with all the ambivalences between faith, hope, deception, and truth. Chapter 12, Helena Blavatsky and the Modern Theosophical Society. The second half of the 19th century was an epoch full of contrasts. On the one hand, science and technology triumphed, the Industrial Revolution radically changed life, Darwin questioned the self-image of man with his theory of evolution, and the natural sciences moved more and more into the center of the explanation of the world. On the other hand, however, a new form of esotericism flourished, which did not hide in the shadow of the Enlightenment, but appeared openly and claimed to offer a comprehensive worldview that reconciled nature, spirit, and religion. At the forefront of this movement was Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, one of the most dazzling and at the same time most controversial figures of modern esotericism. With the founding of the Theosophical Society in New York in 1875, she laid the foundation for a movement that continued well into the 20th century and still has influence today. Blavatsky, born in Ukraine in 1831, came from a noble family of the Tsarist Empire. Early on, she developed an interest in the occult, the supernatural, and foreign cultures. She later claimed to have traveled widely, to have visited India, Tibet, and Egypt, and to have been introduced to the circle of secret masters there. These mysterious Mahatmas or masters of wisdom are spiritually highly evolved beings who live in secret and direct the fate of humanity. Blavatsky saw herself as its mouthpiece, as a mediator between the hidden hierarchy and humanity. Together with Henry Steele Olcott, an American lawyer and journalist, and William Quan Judge, a lawyer, she founded the Theosophical Society in New York in 1875. Their stated goal was to promote a brotherhood of humanity, to conduct comparative religious research, and to promote the study of natural forces, hidden laws, and the potential of man. In doing so, it claimed to be a movement that went beyond religions and embodied a universal wisdom. Blavatsky's first major work, Isis Unveiled, 1877, was a wild, extensive attempt to combine science, religion, and occultism. She took up topics such as Hermeticism, Kabbalah, Alchemy, Gnosis, and Eastern philosophies and placed them in a common context. The book was a success and made Blavatsky known in esoteric circles. But her actual main work appeared a few years later, The Secret Doctrine, 1888, a monumental work in 2 volumes that forms the basis of modern theosophy. In The Secret Doctrine, Blavatsky designed a comprehensive cosmological and anthropological system. She claimed that the world was characterized by cycles of evolution that included not only material but also spiritual development. Humanity is not the product of a purely biological process, but part of a cosmic plan in which different root races appeared on Earth one after the other. This doctrine combined mythical narratives with occult ideas and gave them a pseudo-scientific form that fascinated many readers. Blavatsky drew on Eastern philosophies, especially Hinduism and Buddhism, and presented them in a way that appealed to Western seekers. The emphasis on Eastern wisdom was one of the great features of theosophy. Blavatsky and Olcott moved to India in 1879, where they founded the headquarters of the Theosophical Society in Udayan near Madras. There they came into contact with Hindu and Buddhist reform movements and supported them in the fight against Christian missionaryism. In this way, the Theosophical Society became a bridge between East and West. Many Indians saw it as a support for the rediscovery of their own religious traditions, while Western followers gained access to Far Eastern spirituality through it. However, theosophy was not only a religious movement, but also a social project. She preached the unity of humanity, regardless of race, religion, or gender, and campaigned for the education and emancipation of women. Blavatsky herself was a symbol of female self-assertion in a male-dominated society. She was at the same time a charismatic, polarizing figure who was revered by her followers and defamed as a swindler by her opponents. Critics accused Blavatsky of many of her stories about travels and encounters with secret masters being inventions. The famous Mahatma letters, which were supposedly transmitted to their students by the invisible teachers from Tibet, are also largely considered forgeries today. Nevertheless, this did not detract from the attractiveness of the movement. The belief in a hidden brotherhood of initiates guarding the knowledge of mankind was a powerful myth that attracted many people. The effect of theosophy was enormous. It inspired an entire generation of artists, writers, and thinkers. In painting, artists such as Wassily Kandinsky and Piet Mondrian took up theosophical ideas that spoke of a higher spiritual reality behind the visible world. In literature, the movement influenced authors such as William Butler Yeats and Hermann Hesse. The modern currents of esotericism, New Age, and alternative spirituality are also hardly conceivable without Blavatsky. At the same time, theosophy had an important political dimension. In India, it played a role in strengthening national self-confidence and fending off Western cultural dominance. In Europe and America, she promoted intercultural dialogue and helped Buddhist and Hindu concepts such as karma and reincarnation find their way into Western discourse. After Blavatsky's death in 1891, there were divisions and power struggles within the Theosophical Society, but the movement remained alive. Figures such as Annie Besant and Charles Leadbeater continued the work, and under their leadership, society continued to gain great influence. Besant in particular combined theosophical ideas with political commitment, for example for the women's movement or the Indian struggle for independence. In retrospect, it can be seen that Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society marked a decisive step in the history of esotericism. For the first time, an esoteric movement with worldwide aspirations appeared, which was not limited to secret circles, but acted openly and positioned itself as an alternative worldview alongside science and religion. Blavatsky's teachings were a complex web of myth, occultism, philosophy, and intercultural encounters, fascinating for some, irritating for others. So Blavatsky remains an ambivalent but central figure of modern esotericism. Their writings and their society gave esotericism a new form: global, systematic, and self-confident. Even though many of her claims are viewed critically today, she has permanently changed the image of spiritual quest in the West. It opened the door to an esotericism that no longer existed only in secret, but appeared as a movement of worldwide importance. Chapter 13. Rudolf Steiner and Anthroposophy. Rudolf Steiner is one of those figures who decisively shaped esoteric currents of the 20th century and at the same time had a far-reaching impact on social and cultural areas. With the foundation of anthroposophy, he developed not only a comprehensive spiritual worldview, but also concrete applications in education, agriculture, art, medicine, and architecture. In doing so, he created a movement that still exists today and has found numerous followers worldwide. While Helena Blavatsky prepared the ground for a modern, globally oriented esotericism with the Theosophical Society, it was Steiner who placed these currents on their own, European basis and at the same time transferred them into practical areas of life. Steiner was born in 1861 in Kraljevec in what is now Croatia, which at the time belonged to the Habsburg Empire. He first studied natural sciences and philosophy in Vienna and showed an early interest in Kant, Goethe, and questions of consciousness. He was particularly fascinated by Goethe's scientific writings. He saw in them an access to a living conception of nature that pointed beyond mechanistic materialism. Already in his early works, Steiner emphasized that man could reach deeper truths not only through external observation, but also through inner training and spiritual knowledge. In the 1890s, Steiner joined the Theosophical Society, which at the time was strongly influenced by Blavatsky's successors Annie Besant and Helena Leadbeater. Initially, he held leading positions in the German section, but tensions soon arose. Steiner criticized the strong emphasis on Far Eastern teachings and the claim to present the Indian boy Jiddu Krishnamurti as a kind of world teacher. For Steiner, Europe's spiritual task was not to imitate Asian traditions, but to develop its own, Western Christian esotericism. In 1913, there was finally a break with the Theosophical Society, and Steiner founded the Anthroposophical Society. The core of anthroposophy was Steiner's conviction that man could reach higher levels of consciousness through inner training and meditation. He developed detailed instructions on how access to spiritual worlds is possible through concentration exercises, imaginative ideas, inspirational deepening, and intuitive cognition. He spoke of supernatural insights that cannot be accessed through the ordinary senses, but through trained inner perception. Steiner understood anthroposophy as a spiritual science that could be pursued just as systematically and methodically as the natural sciences, except that it was directed towards spiritual rather than material phenomena. A central element of his teaching was reincarnation and karma. Man is not limited to a single life, but develops through many incarnations, in which he gathers experiences and works on his spiritual being. This development is embedded in a cosmic plan in which Christ plays a central role. In contrast to theosophy, which often emphasized Eastern deities and masters, Steiner placed the Christ impulse at the center of his esotericism. For him, the incarnation of Christ was a world historical event that lifted humanity to a new level of spiritual development. In this way, Steiner closely linked esotericism with a Christian foundation, albeit in an unconventional, mystical form. Steiner's ability to apply his teachings to practical areas of life was particularly formative. In education, he developed Waldorf education, which began in 1919 with the founding of the first Waldorf school in Stuttgart. It was based on the principle that education should promote the child's entire personality, head, heart, and hand. Steiner emphasized the importance of artistic subjects, rhythmic design, and age-appropriate development. Today, there are thousands of Waldorf schools around the world that are based on his basic ideas. In agriculture, Steiner founded biodynamic agriculture, which he presented in 1924 in a famous agricultural course. It was based on the idea that the farm must be considered as an organism in which soil, plants, animals, and people form a unit. Steiner recommended special preparations made from medicinal plants, minerals, and cow dung that should revitalize the soil and take into account the cosmic rhythms. These approaches were the forerunner of today's organic farming and are still alive in many biodynamic farms today. Anthroposophy was also used in medicine. Steiner worked with doctors and developed anthroposophical medicine that combined conventional methods with spiritual insights. Remedies such as mistletoe therapy for cancer were developed from these approaches. In art, his ideas inspired new forms of eurythmy, an art of movement that was intended to make language and music visible through gestures. A central symbol of anthroposophy was the Goetheanum, a building in Dornach in Switzerland, which was built as the center of the movement. Steiner himself designed the architecture, which was characterized by organic forms, special proportions, and symbolic design. The Goetheanum was not only intended to be a meeting place, but also a work of art that made the spiritual world visible. Anthroposophy met with a great response, but also with fierce criticism. Many scientists accuse Steiner of not being verifiable and of contradicting scientific methodology. Church circles were also skeptical of him, as he interpreted Christianity in an esoteric direction. Nevertheless, the movement found numerous followers, precisely because it combined spirituality with concrete areas of life. Steiner himself remained a charismatic, but also controversial figure. His lectures, of which he gave hundreds throughout Europe, attracted large crowds. He spoke freely, improvised, and created comprehensive images of the cosmos, human history, and the future. His followers revered him as a teacher, while critics described him as a fantasist or charlatan. After Steiner's death in 1925, the Anthroposophical Society continued its work. Anthroposophical institutions in education, agriculture, medicine, and art were established worldwide. The movement has millions of followers to this day and influences both alternative and established structures. Waldorf schools, Demeter farms, or anthroposophical clinics are integral parts of many societies. In retrospect, it becomes clear that Steiner created a unique synthesis with anthroposophy. He combined esoteric knowledge with modern social challenges. Where Blavatsky primarily designed a comprehensive world system, Steiner looked for concrete applications. In doing so, he gave esotericism a new form, not as mere secret knowledge, but as a practical philosophy of life. Anthroposophy is therefore more than just a spiritual teaching. It is a cultural movement that ranges from architecture to agriculture, from education to medicine. It is an example of the attempt to understand esotericism not as an alternative world, but as a complement and extension of modern society. Even though many of her claims remain scientifically controversial, her enduring impact shows that she speaks to a deep longing for meaning, wholeness, and spiritual orientation. Chapter 14. Aleister Crowley and Modern Occultism. When one thinks of the most dazzling and at the same time most controversial figures of modern esotericism, the name Aleister Crowley inevitably comes to mind. Hardly any other personality has shaped the image of occultism in the 20th century as strongly as he did, polarized it, and carried it into popular culture. For some he was a genius, a mystic and reformer of spirituality. For others a charlatan, a provocateur, or even a tool of dark forces. With his teachings, writings, and eccentric lifestyle, Crowley became the embodiment of a modern, rebellious occultism that broke with tradition and at the same time opened up new paths. Crowley was born in 1875 into a wealthy family in Leamington Spa, England. His parents were devout members of the Evangelical Plymouth Brethren, and the young Edward Alexander Crowley, his birth name, grew up in a climate of religious strictness. Early on, he began to rebel against this narrowness, which shaped in him an attitude that was to determine his later life. A mixture of rebellion, search for freedom, and a deep fascination for the forbidden. He studied at Cambridge, where he studied not only literature and chess, but also poetry, sexuality, and the first occult texts. He soon dropped his birth name and called himself Aleister Crowley to express his own identity. His esoteric career began when he joined the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, an occult society that had great influence in England in the late 19th century. The Golden Dawn combined elements of Kabbalah, alchemy, astrology, tarot, and magical rituals into a complex system. There Crowley met important personalities such as the poet William Butler Yeats. But Crowley was not prepared to subordinate himself to the hierarchies of society. Conflicts with other members eventually led to his expulsion. This break was crucial, because it made Crowley independent and encouraged him to develop his own system. A key experience for Crowley's later work was his trip to Egypt in 1904. There he claimed to have received a revelation. A superhuman being named Iwas dictated the Book of the Law to him, the central work of his new religion, which he called Thelema. The core of this doctrine can be summarized in 2 sentences: do what you will, let the whole law be, and love is the law, love under will. In doing so, Crowley set a radical alternative to traditional moral concepts. For him, it was about the fact that every person had to recognize and realize his or her true will, an individual life task that went beyond external rules. Crowley's Thelema was not a mere philosophical concept, but a comprehensive esoteric teaching that included rituals, magic, symbols, and spiritual exercises. He combined Eastern traditions such as yoga and tantra with Western ritual magic, astrology, and Kabbalah. For him, magic was the science and art of bringing about change in accordance with the will. In doing so, he emphasized both the inner training of the mind and ritual practices, which were often deliberately provocative. Sexuality played a central role in his teachings. Crowley saw sexual energy as a force that could be used for spiritual transformation and developed concepts of sex magic from it, which were considered scandalous in his time. His life was marked by excesses, travels, and scandals. He undertook expeditions to the Himalayas, lived in Mexico, Paris, and New York, experimented with drugs, and wrote poems, essays, and occult writings in large numbers. In the press, he was nicknamed the most evil person in the world, a reputation that he himself fueled through targeted provocations. He stylized himself as the Antichrist, as the prophet of a new age, and as the innovator of magic. This mixture of seriousness, provocation, and self-dramatization made him a figure who blurred the boundaries between mystic, artist, and scandalous figure. Crowley's influence was also evident in the esoteric organizations he belonged to or shaped. Particularly important was his involvement in the Ordo Templi Orientis, OTO, an occult brotherhood that relied heavily on rituals, sexual magic, and thelemic teachings. Under Crowley's influence, the OTO developed into one of the most important organizations of modern occultism. To this day, there are groups that refer to his teachings and practice his rituals. Despite, or perhaps because of, the many controversies, Crowley had a great influence on modern esotericism. He combined old traditions with modern approaches, took up Far Eastern practices, and integrated them into Western systems. His emphasis on individual will, freedom, and self-realization made him a forerunner of those currents that became popular in the 20th century in the context of counterculture, New Age, and pop culture. Musicians such as the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, and David Bowie were inspired by Crowley, and his symbolism found its way into art, literature, and film. But Crowley's legacy is ambivalent. Critics see him as a narcissist who manipulated people and sold his excesses as a spiritual practice. Many of his writings are difficult to access, full of symbolism and deliberate provocations. His experiments with drugs and sexuality often led to destruction, and his end of life was marked by poverty and disease. Nevertheless, he remains a key figure in modern occultism, precisely because he broke taboos, crossed boundaries, and combined esotericism with a rebellious spirit. In retrospect, Crowley can be seen as an archetype of the modern magician, a person who consciously staged himself, created myths around his person, and pulled esotericism out of the shadows and into the public eye. He made the occult a topic that was not only cultivated in secret circles, but was also present in the wider culture. His teaching of the Thelema remains for many to this day a way to seek spirituality beyond traditional religions, radically free, individual, and at the same time embedded in a network of symbols and rituals. This shows that Aleister Crowley was much more than an eccentric marginal figure. He embodied the dynamics of modern esotericism, the break with conventions, the combination of old traditions with new ideas, the mixture of spiritual search and cultural provocation. His influence extends into our time, and whether one admires or disapproves of him, he remains one of the defining figures of modern occultism, a symbol of the dark, fascinating, and rebellious side of esoteric history. Chapter 15: Esotericism in the Early 20th Century, Between World Wars and Modernity. The early 20th century was an epoch of profound upheavals, and esotericism reflected these developments in its own way. The period between the two world wars was marked by political crises, economic upheavals, and social upheavals that massively shook confidence in existing orders. In this climate, many people were looking for new meanings, for worldviews that explained not only the material but also the spiritual dimension of life. Esotericism, which had found a firm place in cultural life since the 19th century through movements such as theosophy, Spiritism, and occultism, experienced further differentiation in this epoch. It developed both in the traditional channels of lodges, societies and orders and in new forms that responded to the challenges of the modern world. An important aspect was the continued influence of the Theosophical Society, which had built a bridge between East and West since Blavatsky and Alcott. Under Annie Besant and Charles Leadbeater, society flourished in the first decades of the 20th century. She took concepts such as karma, reincarnation, and the evolution of the soul and presented them to a Western audience that sought spiritual orientation in the increasing secularization. At the same time, theosophy combined its doctrine with a claim to social reform. Annie Besant was committed to women's rights and the Indian struggle for independence, which also gave the Theosophical Society a political dimension. Theosophy also produced new figures who were to have a great effect. One of the most famous was Jiddu Krishnamurti, who was initially presented by Besant and Leadbeater as a kind of messiah of the new era. He was seen as the heralded world teacher, but Krishnamurti eventually rejected this role and developed his own philosophy, which relied more on individual freedom, consciousness, and direct experience. This episode shows the ambivalence of esotericism of the time. On the one hand, it searched for universal truths and figures of salvation. On the other hand, it reacted flexibly to the rejection of authoritarian structures. Parallel to theosophy, numerous occult orders and societies continued to develop. The Ordo Templi Orientis, OTO, which integrated thelemic teachings and sexual magic under the influence of Aleister Crowley, was an example of the radical side of modern occultism. The Golden Dawn, from which Crowley had emerged, disintegrated into various currents, but his symbolism and rituals had an effect far into the esoteric scene. Tarot, Kabbalah, alchemy, and astrology were combined in new systems and practiced in complex initiation rites. In Germany and Austria, esoteric currents were formed, some of which developed a dangerous proximity to politics. The combination of nationalist movements and occult ideas was particularly striking. Groups such as the Thule Society combined Germanic mythology, Ariosophy, and esoteric worldviews with nationalist and racist ideologies. These currents were part of the intellectual climate from which National Socialism emerged. Although the Nazi state was later ambivalent towards esotericism, on the one hand it used myths, symbols, and occult ideas. On the other hand, it persecuted competing secret societies. The combination of esotericism and politics during this period shows the power of such ideas. In addition to these dark currents, however, there were also approaches that integrated esotericism more strongly into everyday life and culture. Rudolf Steiner, who has already been discussed in the previous chapter, developed anthroposophy into a comprehensive movement with schools, farms, clinics, and artistic institutions. He was thus an example of how esoteric thinking could be translated into concrete social structures. The art of the early 20th century was also strongly influenced by esoteric ideas. Artists such as Wassily Kandinsky, Piet Mondrian, and Paul Klee drew on theosophical and anthroposophical concepts to develop their abstract art. Kandinsky, for example, spoke of the spiritual in art and saw abstraction as a way to make invisible spiritual realities visible. Music, literature, and theatre were also influenced by esoteric ideas that flourished in the avant-garde currents of modernity. Spiritism, which had reached its peak in the 19th century, remained popular in the early 20th century. Especially after the First World War, it experienced a renaissance. Millions of dead, entire generations of young men, had remained on the battlefields. In this collective mourning, the need to make contact with the deceased grew. Seances, media, and paranormal phenomena gained in importance again. Prominent figures such as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle also continued to advocate spiritualism. At the same time, new scientific societies emerged that researched paranormal phenomena. Parapsychology established itself as a discipline that investigated phenomena such as telepathy, clairvoyance, or psychokinesis. Even though many results were controversial, parapsychology shows the effort to place esoteric topics within the framework of scientific methodology. This made it clear that the boundary between esotericism and science was not as clear at this time as it often seems in retrospect. The esotericism of the early 20th century was characterized by a remarkable internationality. Ideas traveled faster than ever before. Books were published worldwide, societies established branches in different countries, and travelers brought concepts from India, Tibet, or Japan to Europe and America. This globalization of esotericism led to a mixing of traditions that is still formative today. Yoga, meditation, Eastern religions, and Western occultism began to penetrate each other more strongly. The two world wars seemed like caesuras. World War I led to a massive demand for comfort and meaning, which gave a boost to Spiritism, Theosophy, and related movements. The Second World War, on the other hand, revealed the destructive power of ideologies that had abused esoteric elements. After 1945, a reassessment began. While some currents were pushed underground, others prepared the ground for the spirituality of the second half of the 20th century, especially the New Age. In retrospect, It can be said that esotericism experienced a phase of prosperity in the early 20th century on the one hand, but also got into dangerous political contexts on the other. It was part of cultural modernity, inspired art, literature, and science, but at the same time it was co-opted by forces that used it for ideological purposes. This ambivalence makes the epoch particularly exciting. It shows the power of esoteric ideas in a time of upheaval and illustrates how much they were woven into the collective consciousness of modernity. Thus, the esotericism between the world wars is a mirror of its time. It carried hope for a new humanity, offered comfort in times of grief and destruction, inspired art and culture, and at the same time was integrated into political currents that had catastrophic consequences. This complexity shapes its legacy to this day and makes it an important chapter in the history of esoteric thought. Chapter 16. New Age, the Spirituality of the Second Half of the 20th Century. The second half of the 20th century brought forth a new wave of spiritual movements, which became known as the New Age. While the first decades of the century were marked by wars, political conflicts, and the rise of totalitarian ideologies, the post-war period, and especially the 1960s and 1970s, opened up new spaces for alternative ways of life, spiritual search, and cultural experimentation. The New Age was an expression of a deep need for meaning, wholeness, and a connection between inner experience and social change. It combined elements from Eastern religions, Western esotericism, psychology, the environmental movement, and pop culture to form a broad spectrum that continues to have an impact today. The roots of the New Age lie in the esoteric traditions of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Theosophy, anthroposophy, occultism, and the spiritual reform movements provided many terms and concepts that were later taken up in the New Age: karma, reincarnation, meditation, cosmic energies, or the idea of a spiritual evolution of humanity. But while these older movements were often organized in closed societies, lodges, or churches, the New Age emerged as an open, multifaceted, and individualistic phenomenon. A key moment was the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s. The hippie movement, the student protests, the civil rights movement, and the growing criticism of materialism and war, especially the Vietnam War, led to a search for alternative ways of life. Spirituality was no longer understood as a pure question of faith, but as part of a holistic lifestyle. Music, art, politics, and esotericism flowed into each other. Festivals like Woodstock became symbols of a counterculture that propagated freedom, love, and spiritual openness. The New Age was strongly influenced by the reception of Eastern teachings. Yoga, meditation, Zen Buddhism, and Hindu philosophy have found a wide audience in the West since the 1960s. Teachers such as Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who worked with the Beatles, or Tenzin Gyatso, the Dalai Lama, brought Buddhist and Hindu concepts to the Western world. The idea that one could gain direct access to a higher reality through meditation and expansion of consciousness fit perfectly into the mood of a generation that rejected existing institutions and sought its own ways. At the same time, a close connection between spirituality and psychology developed. Movements such as humanistic psychology, represented by Abraham Maslow or Carl Rogers, emphasize the potential for human growth and the possibility of self-realization. These ideas were linked to spiritual concepts. In the 1970s, this gave rise to the so-called transpersonal psychology, which understood spiritual experiences as a legitimate part of human development. Figures such as Stanislav Grof used breathing techniques or consciousness-expanding substances to investigate states that were reminiscent of mystical experiences. Another characteristic of the New Age was the integration of esoteric practices into everyday life. Astrology experienced a renaissance, tarot cards became popular, crystals and healing stones were considered carriers of energies, and alternative healing methods such as Reiki, homeopathy, or acupuncture were widely used. These practices were often in contrast to established medicine and science, but offered many people the feeling of being able to actively work on their own health and spiritual growth. The term New Age itself refers to the idea of an imminent New Age. Inspired by astrological ideas, people spoke of the Age of Aquarius, which was supposed to bring a new consciousness, peace, and harmony. This image of cosmic change gave the movement a utopian dimension. Personal spiritual growth was part of a larger transformation process in which all of humanity would be lifted to a higher level. Important centers of the New Age emerged in California, especially at the Esalen Institute in Big Sur. Philosophers, psychologists, artists, and spiritual teachers met there to develop new forms of therapy, bodywork, and spiritual practice. Workshops on topics such as meditation, self-awareness, group dynamics, or consciousness-expanding methods became experimental fields of a culture that combined individual transformation with social change. Pop culture also played a central role. Music became a medium of the New Age. Bands such as Pink Floyd, Jefferson Airplane, or the Beatles integrated spiritual and esoteric themes into their lyrics and performances. Later, artists such as Enya or Kitaro created their own New Age musical aesthetic, which was intended to convey a feeling of transcendence through spherical sounds. Literature, films, and art took up spiritual themes and made them accessible to a wide audience. However, the New Age was not just a youth or subculture. It also reached the middle class, which in the 1970s and 1980s was looking for meaning in an increasingly globalized and technological world. Esoteric bookstores, meditation centers, yoga classes, and seminars became integral parts of urban culture. Terms such as self-discovery, energy, or wholeness shaped the discourse and found their way into advertising, wellness offers, and corporate philosophies. Criticism was not long in coming. Scientists accused the New Age of being pseudoscientific and misleading people with unproven cures. Religious groups criticized it as a superficial mixing of traditions that falsifies the actual core of spiritual teachings. There were also tensions within the movement itself. While some emphasized spiritual depth and transformation, others used the growing interest commercially and turned it into a business with seminars, books, and products. Despite this criticism, the New Age remains a decisive chapter in the history of esotericism. It helped bring spiritual practices such as meditation or yoga into the mainstream, which are now widely used and often practiced regardless of their esoteric origin. It opened up the discourse to topics such as environmental awareness, alternative healing methods, and holistic lifestyles. And it shaped a culture in which spirituality is no longer tied to institutions, but can be shaped individually. In retrospect, it can be seen that the New Age democratized esotericism. While earlier esoteric traditions were often secret, exclusive, or elitist, the New Age made spiritual knowledge universally accessible. Everyone could read a book, attend a course, or make their own experiences. This openness led to arbitrariness and superficiality, but at the same time made the movement a mass phenomenon. The New Age was thus more than a fad. It was an expression of a profound change in the spiritual culture of the West. It combined old wisdom with new needs, it reflected the search for wholeness in a fragmented world, and it showed that the longing for the invisible, for the transcendent, does not disappear even in a secularized modernity. Rather, it found new forms in the New Age that continue to have an impact today, in the mindfulness movement, in alternative healing methods, in environmental initiatives, and in the individual spirituality of countless people worldwide. Chapter 17: Esotericism and Pop Culture, Music, Film, and Literature. In the course of the 20th century, and especially since the 1960s, esotericism began to transcend the boundaries of secret circles, occult orders, or spiritual communities and penetrate the broad stream of popular culture. This process was by no means accidental, but reflected the general cultural change of a time in which music, film, literature, and visual arts were increasingly gaining global reach and in which spiritual themes became projection surfaces for social longings, fears, and hopes. While esotericism was once often associated with secrecy and exclusivity, it was now integrated into song lyrics, books, films, and stage sets, visible, tangible, and consumable for a mass audience. In this way, the world of the occult merged with pop culture and had a lasting impact on it. In music, esotericism found perhaps the most direct access to the masses. As early as the 1960s, bands like the Beatles were instrumental in bringing Eastern philosophy and meditation to a wide audience. Her travels to India, her collaboration with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and the integration of mantras and sitar-like sounds into songs made spirituality a component of modern pop music. Other bands such as Jefferson Airplane, Grateful Dead, or Pink Floyd took up psychedelic and spiritual themes, often inspired by the expansion of consciousness, mysticism, and alternative worldviews. Music became a vehicle to describe and hint at experiences beyond the everyday. In the 1970s, the combination of rock music and occultism took on new dimensions. Aleister Crowley, who was already considered a provocateur of the occult during his lifetime, became an icon posthumously. Bands like Led Zeppelin referred to him, not only in lyrics, but also in symbolism and stage aesthetics. Jimmy Page, guitarist of the band, was an avowed admirer of Crowley and even acquired his former estate on Loch Ness. Black Sabbath, one of the founding bands of heavy metal, also consciously relied on occult symbolism, dark themes, and the aura of mystery to add an additional dimension to their music. Metal as a whole developed into a genre that repeatedly took up esoteric and occult motifs, sometimes seriously, sometimes as a provocation, sometimes as a game with symbols. Pentagrams, tarot cards, invocations, or apocalyptic scenarios shaped not only the music, but also the visual appearance. Esotericism was also popular in the field of electronic music. New Age music with artists such as Enya, Kitaro, or Vangelis combined spherical sounds with spiritual messages and became part of a culture that emphasized meditation, relaxation, and inner experience. This music was often listened to in conjunction with yoga, alternative healing methods, or spiritual retreats and strengthened the connection between esotericism and a holistic lifestyle. While music transported esotericism through sound and symbolism, film was a medium that brought visual images of the mysterious and mystical to the general public. Even the German expressionism of the 1920s with films such as Nosferatu or Dr. Mabuse resorted to occult motifs that addressed the unconscious, the demonic, and the invisible. In Hollywood, such themes also found resonance, for example in horror films that depicted ghosts, demons, or supernatural powers. However, the great boom in esoteric film themes began in the 1970s. Films such as Rosemary's Baby or The Exorcist dealt with demonic possession and made playing with religious and occult symbols a mass phenomenon. They created fear and fascination at the same time, as they addressed the possibility of the supernatural in a seemingly rational world. At the same time, there were films that depicted spiritual utopias, such as Hair, which transported the spirit of the hippie movement with its proximity to Eastern spirituality. In the 1980s and 1990s, popularization continued. Blockbusters like Ghostbusters dealt with psychic phenomena in a humorous way, while other films like Stigmata or The Sixth Sense staged serious spiritual themes. In the 2000s, The Matrix gained cult status, a film that translated esoteric concepts such as Maya, the illusion of the world, Gnosis, hidden knowledge, and the idea of a higher reality into a science fiction narrative. Later, The Secret, a mixture of film and book, became a phenomenon that spread the laws of attraction in a form compatible with the masses. From the very beginning, literature was a field in which esoteric topics found broad resonance. As early as the 19th century, novels such as Bulwer's Zanoni or the works of Gustav Meyrink had made esoteric content popular. This tradition continued in the 20th century. Hermann Hesse, for example, combined Eastern wisdom with Western storytelling in Siddhartha and thus appealed to an audience of millions. Fantasy literature such as the works of J.R.R. Tolkien or later J.K. Rowling also took up mythical, magical, and occult motifs, albeit often in fictionalized form. The combination of magic, rituals, secret knowledge, and the search for meaning was a common thread that connected fantasy with esoteric traditions. In addition, countless non-fiction books were created that made esoteric knowledge accessible to a wide audience. Authors such as Carlos Castaneda described their alleged experiences with shamanistic teachers and thus struck a chord with a generation that was looking for alternative spiritual paths. The New Age movement produced bestsellers such as Conversations with God by Neale Donald Walsch or The Prophecies of Celestine by James Redfield. These works combined spiritual messages with exciting narratives and made esotericism suitable for the masses. An interesting aspect is that esotericism often appears in an ambivalent form in pop culture. On the one hand as a serious search for meaning and transcendence, on the other hand as a play with symbols, as a provocation or pure stylistic device. A pentagram in a rock album can refer to deep occult interests as well as an attempt to shock the audience. This openness is what makes the combination of esotericism and pop culture so appealing, but also its superficiality. In retrospect, it can be said that the pop culture of the 20th and 21st centuries not only took up esotericism, but transformed it. She has transformed them from an exclusive, often secret practice into a widely available repertoire of symbols, ideas, and stories. Anyone could come into contact with esoteric ideas through music, films, or books without joining a society or learning rituals. In this way, pop culture democratized esotericism. It made it visible, usable, and consumable. At the same time, the effect remains ambivalent. On the one hand, popularization has led to esoteric ideas reaching wide circles and becoming a natural part of cultural communication today. Terms such as karma, aura, or energy are widely used in everyday life, even if many only understand them superficially. On the other hand, the commercialization of esotericism has also provoked criticism. Deep spiritual traditions have become products, brands, and marketing tools. Despite all the criticism, the history of esotericism in pop culture shows how strong the longing for the mysterious, the mystical, and the transcendent is, even in a modern, secularized society. Music, film, and literature have made this longing visible and given it a stage. In this way, esotericism became part of the collective imagination, an element of the cultural landscape that fascinates, irritates, and inspires at the same time. Chapter 18: Esotericism in the Digital Age, Internet, Social Media, and New Movements. With the entry into the digital age, the world of esotericism has changed fundamentally. Where secret circles, exclusive lodges, or books that are difficult to access used to be the main medium for passing on knowledge and practices, the internet and later social media opened up access to a global audience. Spiritual and esoteric content that was once reserved for a small circle of initiates is now available in a few clicks. This change has democratized and globalized esotericism on the one hand, but on the other hand it has also made it more superficial, fragmented, and more commercialized. At the same time, new movements, inspired by the technical possibilities, have taken on completely independent forms that would hardly be conceivable without digital platforms. As early as the 1990s, as the World Wide Web spread, the first spiritual communities began to use online forums and websites. Here, people exchanged ideas on topics such as astrology, tarot, Reiki, meditation, or UFOs. The internet seemed like a huge archive that brought together old traditions and new knowledge. Libraries that had previously only been accessible to insiders were digitized, and platforms emerged where esoteric literature was available for free or for small fees. Even in this early phase, it became apparent that the internet would take esotericism out of its exclusive framework and make it suitable for the masses. With the advent of social media such as Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and later TikTok, esotericism experienced a new dimension of dissemination. Spiritual influencers began to present their experiences, rituals, and messages to a worldwide audience. Videos about tarot cards, horoscopes, or meditation techniques reached millions of clicks. Hashtags such as #spiritualawakening, #witchtalk, or #manifestation created digital communities where people exchanged, shared their experiences, and developed new practices. Esotericism became part of the visual culture of the internet, easily consumable, often aesthetically staged and adapted to the fast pace of the platforms. The popularity of manifesting, a practice closely linked to the law of attraction, has become particularly striking. Users share short videos on TikTok or Instagram in which they explain how to turn wishes into reality through visualization, positive affirmations, or certain rituals. These ideas are not new. They have their roots in the New Thought movement of the 19th century and were popularized by books like The Secret. But in the digital space, they were given a new reach and a new aesthetic: short clips, inspiring images, motivational music. Manifestation became a lifestyle element that was taken up by young people as well as adults. At the same time, a renaissance of witchcraft culture developed. Under the slogan Witch Talk, a huge community of young people emerged who dealt with witchcraft, herbalism, crystals, and rituals. This movement combines old traditions with modern forms of feminism, queerness, and self-empowerment. Witchcraft is understood not only as a spiritual practice, but also as an expression of identity and resistance to patriarchal or normative structures. The digital space makes it possible for such practices and identities to become visible and form worldwide communities. Classic esoteric topics such as astrology also experienced a renaissance through the internet. While horoscopes used to be mostly in newspapers, apps, blogs, and social media sites have made astrology a ubiquitous phenomenon. Young people share memes about their zodiac signs, compare birth charts, and use astrological interpretations to reflect on relationships, career, or personal development. This new popularity of astrology shows how digital platforms can transform old practices into a new, contemporary form. The globalization of esotericism in the digital space has also led to traditions from different cultures coming into more intensive contact with each other. Yoga, Reiki, shamanism, Ayurveda, or Kabbalah are taught worldwide, often in hybrid forms that mix elements of different origins. On the one hand, this has led to great diversity, but on the other hand, it has also triggered discussions about cultural appropriation. Critics complain that spiritual traditions are torn out of their cultural context, simplified, and commercialized. Commercialization is a central topic in the digital age of esotericism. Online shops sell crystals, incense, tarot cards, or spiritual services on a large scale. Platforms such as Etsy or Instagram have exploded the market for esoteric products, while apps such as CoStar or The Pattern are transforming astrology into a digital, personalized format. These developments show how closely esotericism is linked to consumer culture in the digital age. At the same time, digitization has also enabled new forms of criticism and reflection. Scientific blogs, skeptic forums, and educational platforms deal with esoteric claims and check their validity. The digital space is therefore not only a medium for the dissemination of esotericism, but also a field of debate in which supporters and critics meet. Another important aspect is the role of esotericism in times of crisis. The corona pandemic has shown that digital spaces can offer spiritual refuge. Many people sought support in online meditations, virtual rituals, or spiritual consultations. At the same time, the spread of esoteric content also led to problematic connections with conspiracy theories. Movements such as QAnon took esoteric terms and combined them with political ideologies, creating a dangerous mixture of spirituality and radicalism. This phenomenon illustrates the dark sides of digital esotericism, its susceptibility to instrumentalization and disinformation. Despite all the ambivalences, it can be said that esotericism in the digital age has reached an unprecedented reach and visibility. It is no longer a marginal phenomenon, but part of the global communication culture. Through memes, videos, apps, and digital communities, it is consumed, practiced, and discussed by millions of people. It shapes lifestyles, identities, and discourses, often in a fluid connection with topics such as sustainability, feminism, or mental health. In retrospect, it can be said that the internet meant the same thing to esotericism as the printing press did to the Renaissance, a revolution of dissemination that abolished old boundaries and created new forms. Esotericism has been unbounded, individualized, and globalized. Today, it is less a secret doctrine than a cultural reservoir of symbols, practices, and narratives that can be used flexibly. This shows that the digital age has not only changed esotericism, but also reinvented it. It is a mirror of our time, fast, visual, global, hybrid, but at the same time full of longing for depth, meaning, and community. Between Instagram posts and online rituals, between apps and YouTube videos, modern people are looking for answers to age-old questions in the digital space. Where do we come from? Where are we going? And what gives meaning to our lives? Chapter 19. Criticism, Science, and the Accusation of Pseudoscience. The history of esotericism is not only a history of spiritual practices, secret teachings, and cultural inspiration, but also a history of constant criticism and debate. Since its beginnings, esotericism has been caught between fascination and skepticism, between the search for hidden truths and the accusation of deception. Especially with the rise of modern natural sciences in the 17th and 18th centuries and the increasing secularization of society, the tension between esoteric ideas and scientific thinking grew. In the 19th and 20th centuries, this debate finally intensified into the question of whether esoteric currents provide serious insights into the world or whether, as critics claimed, they were merely pseudosciences. Even in the age of Enlightenment, esotericism was considered by many philosophers and scientists to be a relic of bygone times. Alchemy, astrology, or magic, which had been considered serious disciplines for centuries, were increasingly pushed to the margins. With the development of chemistry, alchemy lost its scientific claim, astrology was replaced by astronomy, and emerging psychology began to explain phenomena that had previously been considered supernatural. This process led to a clearer demarcation. What could not be verified by scientific method was considered irrational or superstitious. But it was precisely during this time that esotericism experienced a new blossoming. Spiritualism, theosophy, or anthroposophy tried to adopt scientific terms and structures in order to gain credibility. Helena Blavatsky, for example, argued that her secret doctrine was compatible with the latest scientific findings, and Rudolf Steiner spoke of spiritual science to underline the seriousness of his teachings. However, this strategy led to scientists reacting all the more sharply. They accused esoteric movements of only using terms and concepts without applying the associated methodology. In the 20th century, the term pseudoscience became a central buzzword in the criticism of esotericism. By this, critics meant that certain teachings may give the appearance of science, but do not meet the criteria of true science, in particular falsifiability, reproducibility, and methodological rigor. Astrology is a classic example. It uses mathematical calculations, tables, and complex systems, but scientific tests have repeatedly shown that astrological predictions are no more reliable than chance. The same applies to homeopathy or other alternative healing methods, which are described as effective by followers, but are usually refuted by studies. However, the confrontation between esotericism and science is not only a question of empirical evidence, but also a cultural and philosophical one. Many followers of esoteric movements emphasize that while science can describe the material world, it does not capture the whole of human experience. They refer to phenomena such as consciousness, intuition, or spiritual experiences that are difficult to express in numbers and experiments. In this sense, they do not see esotericism as a competitor to science, but as a complement that starts where scientific methods reach their limits. Nevertheless, scientific criticism remains sharp. Organizations such as the skeptic movement, which gained influence in the 20th century, especially in the USA and Europe, specifically deal with esoteric claims. They organize conferences, publish studies, and educate people about the dangers of superstition, charlatanry, and pseudoscientific methods. For them, esotericism is not only harmless, but potentially dangerous because it distracts people from science-based solutions. One example is medicine. If patients rely on alternative healing methods and do without conventional treatments, this can be life-threatening. Another aspect of the criticism concerns the economic dimension. Critics accuse esoteric movements of exploiting people through promises of salvation. Esoteric seminars, healing stones, horoscopes, or spiritual consultations are often expensive, according to the critics, are based on unsubstantiated claims. The accusation is that profit is being made here with people's longing for meaning, healing, and orientation, without any real benefit being demonstrable. But the relationship between science and esotericism is not exclusively characterized by confrontation. There were always cross-border commuters who tried to build bridges. Parapsychology, for example, tried to research phenomena such as telepathy or psychokinesis using scientific methods. Although its results are controversial and the discipline has never received widespread recognition, it does show an attempt to introduce esoteric topics into scientific discourse. In physics, too, there are always esoterically inspired interpretations, for example when terms such as quantum field or energy are transferred into spiritual contexts. Critics speak of quantum mysticism here because scientific terms are used in the wrong context. An important point in the discussion is the question of why esotericism remains so popular despite decades of criticism. One explanation lies in the needs it addresses: the search for meaning, for orientation in a complex world, for healing beyond purely technical methods. Science can explain how something works, but it doesn't provide answers to the question of why it exists or what the meaning of life is. This is where esotericism comes in and fills a gap that many people feel. This gap also explains why criticism alone rarely reduces the popularity of esoteric currents. On the contrary, for many supporters, the rejection by scientists only confirms the impression that it is secret knowledge suppressed by the established order. This idea ties in with old ideas of secret teachings and strengthens the attraction of esotericism. In the digital age, the confrontation between science and esotericism has taken on new forms. Blogs, forums, and social media provide space for discussion, but also for the spread of misinformation. Skeptic organizations use the internet to educate, while esoteric movements there massively expand their reach. This often blurs the line between well-founded criticism and esoteric marketing, which makes the discussion even more complex. In retrospect, it can be said that the criticism of esotericism is an indispensable part of its history. Without the constant confrontation with science, enlightenment, and rationality, esotericism would not have become what it is today. A field between mystery and skepticism, between the search for meaning and deception, between inspiration and pseudoscience. For many, it remains a necessary antithesis to a world dominated by technology and rationality, while for others it represents a dangerous illusion. This shows that esotericism is always a mirror of the tensions of our culture. It makes visible where science reaches its limits, and it provokes questions about meaning, wholeness, and transcendence. Whether it is dismissed as pseudoscience or seen as a complement to the rational worldview, it remains an inevitable part of the intellectual landscape of modernity. Chapter 20. Outlook: The Future of Esotericism in the 21st Century. If you look at the long history of esotericism, which stretches from the ancient mystery cults to Hermeticism, Gnosis, Alchemy, theosophy, Spiritism, and the New Age to the digital present, it becomes clear that it has always been more than just a marginal phenomenon. It reflected social developments, cultural needs, and man's eternal search for meaning and transcendence. Even in the 21st century, esotericism does not disappear, but adapts to new framework conditions, but rather seems to take on new forms in a globalized, digitalized, and increasingly crisis-ridden world, which show both continuity and change. The future of esotericism is determined by several trends that are already emerging today. A decisive factor is advancing digitalization. The internet, social media, and mobile apps have taken esotericism out of its niche and integrated it into everyday life. While in the past the focus was on books, seminars, or personal encounters, today everyone can access horoscopes, tarot interpretations, meditation exercises, or astrological analyses via smartphone. Apps such as CoStar, The Pattern, or Sanctuary personalize esoteric practices and appeal above all to a younger generation that organizes their lives digitally anyway. This development will continue to intensify, so that esotericism will merge even more with technologies in the 21st century. Virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and digital platforms could create new forms of spiritual experience, such as virtual rituals, AI-generated horoscopes, or global online communities. A second central trend is individualization. Modern people tend to no longer let their spirituality be determined by traditional institutions or dogmatic systems, but to shape it themselves. The New Age already made spirituality a construction kit from which everyone could choose what appealed to him or her. This trend is intensifying in the 21st century. Esotericism is understood less as a closed worldview, but as a toolbox of practices and symbols that are individually combined. You can combine yoga with tarot, Reiki with mindfulness training, or astrology with coaching. This openness appeals to the longing for self-determination, but also leads to increasing fragmentation. At the same time, the longing for community remains. Digital platforms such as Witch Talk or online forums on topics such as manifestation and crystal healing show that people not only search individually, but also want to network. Communities are no longer formed locally in lodges or circles, but globally in the digital space. This opens up new opportunities, but also leads to greater vulnerability to disinformation or mixing with conspiracy theories. This danger is particularly evident in times of crisis. During the corona pandemic, esoteric narratives combined with political radicalization, which reignited the critical discourse on esotericism. Another central theme of the future is the connection between esotericism and social issues. Overlaps with ecological movements are already evident today. Terms such as Mother Earth, cosmic energy, or Gaia are used to establish a spiritual understanding of ecological responsibility. Biodynamic agriculture, inspired by Rudolf Steiner, is experiencing a renaissance in the context of sustainable agriculture. Many environmental activists associate ecological concerns with spiritual concepts, and it is foreseeable that this connection will become even more important in the 21st century. Esotericism thus becomes a resource for reinterpreting the relationship between man and nature. Health and healing also remain central fields. In a world characterized by stress, acceleration, and chronic diseases, many are looking for alternatives to purely technical medicine. Practices such as meditation, mindfulness, breathing exercises, or healing stones promise not only healing, but also wholeness. The boundaries between esotericism, wellness, and psychology are becoming more and more blurred. While scientific criticism remains loud, the demand for such services will not decrease. On the contrary, it is likely to grow in an aging society that is unsettled by crises. The commercialization of esotericism will also continue. There is already a huge market for books, courses, apps, jewelry, healing stones, or retreats. Influencers and coaches use social media to sell spiritual services, often in a highly professional form. Esotericism has become part of global consumer culture and will remain so. Critics see this as a reduction of spiritual content to mere commodities, while proponents argue that commercialization also facilitates access. This tension between authentic search and economic business will be a central feature of esotericism in the 21st century. In addition, the role of science in the discussion of esotericism will continue to be important. While many esoteric claims have been refuted in the light of empirical methods, the need for meaning that esotericism addresses remains. It is to be expected that borderlands such as consciousness research, neuroscience, or quantum physics will be interpreted esoterically again and again. The discourse on quantum mysticism shows how quickly scientific terms can be transferred into spiritual contexts. Such translations will continue to be part of the debate in the future, whereby the question of the boundaries of science and spirituality will be asked again and again. Another aspect concerns cultural globalization. As early as the 20th century, esotericism integrated traditions from India, Tibet, Japan, or Central America. This trend will continue, but accompanied by a greater sensitivity to cultural appropriation. While in the past exotic practices were often adopted without reflection, today there is a growing awareness that spiritual traditions should be treated with respect and understood in their cultural context. This could lead to a more differentiated, critical form of global esotericism. The future of esotericism will also be shaped by the great challenges facing humanity: climate change, social inequality, digitalization, and geopolitical conflicts. In such times, the need for spiritual orientation, for meaning that goes beyond the material, grows. Esoteric movements will try to provide answers, whether through the imagination of cosmic cycles, the idea of a collective elevation of consciousness, or through spiritual practices that create community and hope. Some of these movements will be utopian, others may get caught up in problematic conspiracy narratives. The ambivalence between healing and divisive effects will continue to accompany esotericism in the 21st century. Looking back on its long history, it can be said that esotericism was always particularly strong when people were looking for orientation, when old orders became brittle and new horizons opened up. The modern age and the digital age are no exception in this regard. Esotericism remains a cultural reservoir that preserves ancient symbols, myths, and practices while constantly reinterpreting them. It is not static, but dynamic, changeable, and adaptable. In the future, it can be expected that esotericism will continue to be part of the cultural landscape, no longer as secret knowledge in secret, but as an open, hybrid, global phenomenon. It is accompanied by criticism, challenged by science, shaped by consumer culture, and practiced by millions of people who find comfort, inspiration, or meaning in it. Whether one dismisses it as pseudoscience or appreciates it as a spiritual complement, it remains an expression of a deep human longing: the search for the invisible, for the hidden, and for a meaning beyond the purely material. This closes the circle. Esotericism, which had its origins in ancient mysteries, has arrived in the 21st century, unbounded, digital, global, and at the same time supported by the same questions that have accompanied it for thousands of years.